She arrived in the Montana wilderness with a small suitcase, a letter of promise, and nothing else. The man who had proposed to her through letters, the man who should have been there waiting for her, didn't show up. Instead, the whole town stared at her like a fool. But Evelyn Hart didn't turn back. She rode alone into the wilderness, seeking out the home of a dying man she'd never met, and decided to turn that abandoned promise into a real life. Please like, comment with the city you're viewing from, so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because the best part is yet to come. The train came in just after 2 in the afternoon, which was late by about 40 minutes. And by the time it ground to a stop at Harlan's Crossing, the platform was already half empty. Most people who had business in town had given up waiting and gone back to it. That left a scattering of idlers and a pair of freight handlers who barely looked up from the crate they were wrestling toward a wagon, and a woman named Ida Marsh, who ran the post office and had a talent for being wherever something interesting was about to happen. Evelyn Hart stepped off the second-to-last car holding a worn leather traveling case in one hand and a folded letter in the other. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, with a face that people sometimes described as handsome rather than pretty, which she had always understood to be a polite way of saying she had strong cheekbones and not much patience for flattery. She wore a gray dress that had been washed enough times to lose most of its original shape, and good boots that had cost her the better part of a month's wages from the laundry and Billings where she'd been working since January. She stood on the platform and looked at the town. Harlan's Crossing was not what she had imagined, though she was honest enough with herself to admit she hadn't imagined much. It was a main street with maybe a dozen buildings on each side, a livery at the far end, and mountains in every direction so enormous they made the whole settlement look temporary, like something someone had set down in a hurry and hadn't decided yet whether to keep. The air smelled of pine and horse and something else she couldn't name, a dryness that had a weight to it, a quality that felt like the land itself was indifferent to whether you were there or not. She looked at the letter again. Though she had read it so many times, the paper was soft at the folds. I will be at the station when the afternoon train arrives on the 15th. You will know me by the blue kerchief I'll be wearing. I am not a man who is good at waiting, but I have never been more glad to wait for anything in my life. Nathan Crowley had written that 6 weeks ago. There was no one on the platform with a blue kerchief. There was no one on the platform who looked like they were waiting for a woman arriving alone from Billings on the strength of 8 months of correspondence and one marriage proposal written in a careful, slightly cramped hand that suggested a man who didn't write much but meant what he wrote. Evelyn stood very still for a moment, the way she had learned to stand still when something was wrong. Not frozen, not panicking, just waiting for her own mind to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. Then she picked up her case and walked toward the only building on the main street with a sign out front that said General Store. Because general stores were where you started when you didn't know where else to start. The woman inside was maybe 50, thick-armed, with reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead, and the particular expression of someone who was deciding how much trouble the newcomer was going to be. "Afternoon," she said. "Afternoon." Evelyn set her case down on the floor. "I'm looking for Nathan Crowley. I was supposed to meet him at the station." Something shifted in the woman's face. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like the slight tightening of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they had been hoping was wrong. "You're the woman from Billings," the woman said. Not a question. "Evelyn Hart." "Margaret Tillis." She didn't offer her hand. "You'd better sit down, Miss Hart." "I'd rather stand, thank you. Where is he?" Margaret Tillis looked at her for a long moment with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. It was the kind of look that worked as both. "Nathan Crowley's been flat on his back at Doc Hennessy's place going on 3 weeks now. Fever took him. Probably spotted fever, the doc thinks, though he's not certain. He was—" She paused. "He was in bad shape when they brought him in. He's still in bad shape." Evelyn heard this the way you hear news you've been bracing for without knowing it, the words landing somewhere in your chest rather than your ears. She said, "Is he going to live?" "Nobody knows." "Who brought him in?" "Garrett Hale found him. He's a trapper, lives up on the North Ridge most of the time. Comes to town every few weeks. Brought Nathan in on the back of his horse because Nathan couldn't sit a saddle." Evelyn nodded slowly. She was still holding the letter. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "Miss Hart." Margaret Tillis's voice had shifted slightly, moved towards something gentler but also more direct. I need to be honest with you. People in this town, they're going to say things. They're already saying things. A mail-order bride showing up when the groom can't even... I appreciate the warning, Evelyn said. Where is Doc Hennessy's place? The doctor was a narrow man with tired eyes who had clearly been managing too many things at once for too long. His office was in a low building set back slightly from the main street, and it smelled of carbolic and old wood and the close, specific smell of illness that Evelyn recognized from the winter her mother had been sick, a smell that got into the walls and stayed there. He looked at her when she came through the door, and then looked past her to see if anyone was with her. And when no one was, he looked back at her with the resigned expression of a man who was about to explain a difficult situation to someone who hadn't asked for it. Miss Hart, he said. He introduced himself as Doc Hennessy, just Hennessy's fine, and gestured toward a chair that she again declined to take. I want to be straightforward with you. Please. Nathan Crowley is alive. That's better than it was a week ago, when I wasn't sure he'd make it through the night. His fever has dropped some, but he's not conscious, and I can't tell you when he will be. It could be days, it could be longer. He hesitated. There's a chance he won't recover fully, even if he lives. Spotted fever it takes things from a man. Strength. Sometimes more than that. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Can I see him? I don't see why not. He led her to the back room. Nathan Crowley was a large man, or had been. She could see the frame of it, the broad shoulders and long legs that must have filled a doorway once, but the fever had burned something out of him and left him sunken in the narrow cot like something that had deflated. His face was rough-bearded, his coloring was bad, and his breathing was shallow but regular. He looked like a man who was losing an argument with his own body. She stood at the foot of the cot and looked at him for a long time. She had been writing to this man for 8 months. She had told him about her mother's death, about the laundry in Billings and the way the steam made her hands red by noon, about the particular loneliness of watching everyone around you build something that you couldn't seem to find the start of yourself. He had told her about the valley, Harlan's Valley, he called it, though it had no official name, and the way the mountains looked in January when the snow was deep enough to silence everything, and the homestead he'd been building piece by piece for 4 years, and how a man could build something right and solid and still come to bed every night aware of how much emptiness a house could hold. She didn't know this man's face. She'd never heard his voice, but she knew his handwriting and the way he apologized for taking a long time between letters by explaining exactly what he'd been doing, which was always something practical. Mending fence, clearing a section of drainage, repacking the chimney mortar. She knew that he was a man who used the word sorry rarely, but meant it when he did. She turned around and walked back out to the front room. I'll need directions to his property, she told Hennessy. He stared at her. Miss Hart, I'm not asking you to take me there. I'm asking you to tell me how to get there. The property's been sitting empty for 3 weeks. Nobody's been out there. There's no way to know what state it's in. He was looking at her the way men sometimes looked at her when they were trying to figure out how much argument it would take to change her mind, and she could see him reaching the conclusion that the answer was more than he had. It's a 2-hour ride north. You'd need a horse. Where's the livery? The man at the livery was named Dooley, and he rented her a bay mare with the resigned air of someone who had learned not to ask questions that weren't his business, which she appreciated. He did ask once whether she knew the road north. No, she said. Tell me, he told her. It was straightforward enough. North out of town, follow the creek for about 6 miles, then cut west at the big split rock formation you couldn't miss, and the homestead would be visible from the ridge once you cleared the tree line. He described it the way someone describes a place they've been to enough times that they don't think about it, which told her people in town knew the property well enough, which meant they knew it was sitting empty. She was loading her case onto the saddle when she became aware of people watching. There were maybe 4 or 5 of them. A man sitting outside the saloon, 2 women on the far side of the street, an old man with a pipe who had simply stopped walking and turned to look. They weren't hostile exactly, but there was something in the quality of their attention that was worse than hostility. It was the attention you gave to something that was going to fail, patient and unsurprised, the way you'd watch a wheel that was already loose coming off a wagon. They were waiting to see what she'd do when she figured out what she'd ridden into. She tightened the saddle strap, checked that her case was secure, put her foot in the stirrup, and rode north. The road was a generous term for what it actually was, which was a set of ruts through tall grass that got progressively less convincing as the miles added up. The creek was there, though, just as Dooley had described, running fast and cold over gray stones, and she followed it. The mountains were enormous on both sides, the kind of enormous that stops being dramatic and just becomes weather, becomes the permanent condition of the landscape. She found the split rock. She cut west. She crested the ridge as the late afternoon light was going golden and long, and she saw the homestead below her in the valley. Her first thought was that it was smaller than she'd imagined. Her second thought was that it was a mess. The main house was a low structure of notched logs, solid-looking in its bones, but with a window broken out on the east side and the front step visibly rotted. There was a barn set back from the house that was intact but had one of its doors hanging at an angle, and a fence line that had been built with care at some point, but had since lost several sections to what looked like frost heave or simple neglect. A chicken coop sat at the far end of the property, and she could see from here that the gate was open and there were no chickens in sight. She sat on the mare at the top of the ridge and looked at all of it for a long moment. Then she rode down. The inside of the house was cold and smelled of disuse. Someone, probably the trapper, Garrett Hale, when he'd come to collect Nathan, had at least closed the door so the animals hadn't gotten in, and the furniture was intact. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with a decent mattress rolled to one side, a cast-iron stove that she opened and found clean and in working order. There were shelves with canned goods, enough for a while, and a good woodpile outside, and tools hung neatly on pegs inside the barn, which told her that whatever else Nathan Crowley was, he wasn't careless with his equipment. She found a lamp with oil in it. She found matches. She found a water barrel around the side of the house that was empty, which meant she'd need to bring up water from the creek in the morning. She lit the lamp, rolled out the mattress on the bed frame, put her case on the table, and sat down in one of the chairs. She was in a stranger's house in a valley she'd never seen before, with no money beyond what was in her coat pocket, no way back to Billings that she could afford, and a man she'd never met lying unconscious in a doctor's office 2 hours south, who might or might not live to have a conversation with her. She should have felt more afraid. She recognized that, in a detached sort of way. She recognized that a reasonable person in her position would have a more visible response to the situation. But fear had always seemed to her like a luxury, the kind of thing you could afford if you had somewhere safe to feel it. She had not often had somewhere safe to feel it, and so she had mostly learned to do without. She ate 2 biscuits from the paper she'd bought at the general store in town, and drank from her canteen and went to sleep in a dead man's house, or a man who might be dying, with the mountains all around in the dark. She dreamed nothing. She was up before the light. The first thing she did was walk the property. Not quickly, not with any plan in mind, just a slow circuit to understand what she was actually dealing with. The fence line was bad, but not irreparable. 3 sections down, all of them on the western side, which was probably the direction the snow pressure came from in winter. The barn door needed a new hinge, which would be easy if she could find the right hardware or fabricate something close enough. The chicken coop situation was a loss for now. Whatever chickens Nathan had kept were gone, dispersed into the valley or taken by predators, and she'd deal with that later. The larger problem was the livestock. There were tracks in the soft ground near the barn. Horses, at least 2 of them, and what looked like cattle, though the tracks were 3 weeks old and hard to read. They'd drifted. Where? She didn't know yet. Finding them would require either help or more time on horseback than she could manage alone in the first few days while she was still learning the property. She went back inside and made a fire in the stove. She had enough to do without worrying about what she couldn't fix yet. Start with the stove, start with the water, start with the fence line. That was the thing about a place in this kind of disarray. The work itself was the structure. You did the next thing, and then the next, and you didn't look at the whole pile of it at once, because the whole pile of it would stop you cold. She had the fire going and the coffee on when she heard a horse outside. She didn't have a weapon. She noted that, briefly and without panic, just filed it as information and picked up the iron poker from beside the stove before she went to the door and opened it. The man outside was big, not tall exactly, but broad in the chest and shoulders, in the way of someone who had been doing physical work for a long time, with a beard that had gone past the stage of intention and into the stage of just being how his face looked. He was sitting a gray horse, and he was holding a rabbit by the ears in one hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that was completely unreadable. "You're the woman from Billings," he said. She was starting to get tired of that sentence. "Evelyn Hart. Garrett Hale." He looked at the poker. "You planning to use that?" "Not if you give me a reason not to." He looked at her for another moment. Then he dismounted and held up the rabbit. "I was going to leave this for Nathan. Figured he'd be back by now." He seemed to be reassessing a number of things simultaneously. "He's not back. He's still at Hennessy's." She held the door open. "You want coffee?" He looked mildly surprised by the question, as if hospitality in a house that wasn't hers to offer wasn't what he'd expected. He came inside anyway. Them tit. Garrett Hale drank his coffee standing up and didn't offer small talk, which she respected. He answered her questions directly. How far the valley extended, where the nearest water source was beyond the creek, where Nathan's cattle were most likely to have drifted, which neighbors were which, and how far away they were. There were 5 other homesteads in the valley. The Keenans, a farm couple with 3 children, were the closest, maybe 4 miles east. Then there were a couple of widows, Elena Marsh, no relation to the postmaster woman in town, and a woman named Frances Dodd, who everyone called Fran. There were 2 brothers named Alcott who ran cattle on the south end of the valley, and an older man named Phelps, who kept to himself and had a reputation for being either very private or very unfriendly, depending on who you asked. "What about the land to the west?" she asked. Something in Garrett's face shifted. "Victor Rourke." "Who is he?" "A man who's been buying up grazing rights on the western approach for about 2 years. Has about 40 hands working for him now, maybe more. He's been pushing east." He looked into his cup. "Nathan didn't sell to him." "I know. He mentioned it in a letter." Garrett looked up at that briefly. "Nathan wrote you about Rourke?" "He wrote that a man had come to him wanting to buy the valley property and that he'd said no. He didn't say much else. Rourke doesn't like the word no." "Few people do," Evelyn said. "That doesn't usually give them the right to ignore it." Garrett set his cup on the table. He was looking at her with the same assessing expression he'd had since he arrived, but there was something less neutral in it now, a quality of attention that was slightly more deliberate. "What are you planning to do, Miss Hart?" "Fix the fence line first, then find the cattle." She paused. "I'll need a hammer and wire. Nathan's tools. Is there anything in the barn that would work?" "There's wire on the back wall of the barn, left side. Staples in a tin on the workbench." "Good." She stood up and rinsed her cup. "I'd appreciate your help with the cattle, if you're willing. You'll know the valley better than I do." He didn't answer right away. He was looking at her the way men looked at her sometimes when they were revising something they'd assumed and weren't sure yet what to replace it with. "I'll come back Thursday," he said. "We'll look for them then." "Thank you." He took the rabbit when he left, said she probably couldn't use it right now and he'd bring it back Thursday too. And she stood in the doorway and watched him ride north until the tree line swallowed him. What? She worked through the afternoon and into the evening. The fence line was hard work. The ground was harder than she expected, and the posts she had to reset were heavier than they looked, and by the time she'd repaired 2 of the 3 downed sections, her hands were raw and her shoulders ached in a way she knew would be worse in the morning. But the fence stood when she was done with it, plumb and taut, and that was something. She fixed the barn door hinge with the length of flat iron she found in the barn's miscellaneous pile and a borrowed technique from watching the maintenance man at the laundry in Billings, who'd been a practical and innovative man when it came to making do with what was available. It wasn't pretty, but it held. She found 2 chickens. They were in the tall grass behind the coop, living their lives with the philosophical adaptability of chickens everywhere. And she herded them back into the coop with the focused patience of someone who had never herded a chicken before but was determined to figure it out. It took longer than it should have. She did not find this particularly funny while it was happening, but she thought she might later. In the evenings, when the light was gone and the fire was the only warm thing, she wrote. She kept a journal, had since she was 14, a habit she'd started because she'd needed somewhere to put things she couldn't say out loud and couldn't afford to forget. She wrote about the fence. She wrote about the barn door and the chickens. She wrote about Garrett Hale and his gray horse and the way he'd looked at her like she was a problem he was trying to solve but hadn't expected to find interesting. She wrote about Nathan, too. about the man she'd never met lying in a doctor's office with his life in the balance, and whether what she felt for him was love or the idea of love or something else entirely. The connection built entirely from words on paper, from the careful trust of a man who wrote letters like he was making a promise. She didn't know yet. She thought she'd have to meet him conscious to know. She wrote, "I have made myself at home in his house. I don't know if that's presumptuous or just practical. Probably both." She went into town 3 days later to return Dooley's horse and arrange to borrow a different animal, a working horse she could use for heavier tasks. She also needed supplies she didn't have and couldn't improvise. The looks hadn't changed. If anything, they'd sharpened slightly, because now people had had time to add texture to their opinions. She was aware of the whispers, not the words, but the shape of them, the particular way conversations paused when she came into earshot and resumed when she moved away. Mail-order bride. Man's not even conscious to take her in. Brazen thing. What does she think she's doing out there? She went to Margaret Tillis's general store because she had to buy things, and also because Margaret had been straight with her, which was more than she could say for most of the town so far. Margaret watched her come in, watched her put together her list, wire staples, a new axe handle, flour and salt and lard and dried beans, and then said, with the careful neutrality of someone leaving a door open, "Doc Hennessy says Nathan came around for a few minutes yesterday morning." Evelyn went still. "He was conscious?" "Briefly. Didn't know where he was," Doc said, "but he was awake." Margaret paused. "He asked about his horses." Evelyn almost smiled. The thing about horses was that they were never abstract. No one lying half out of their mind with fever asked about horses as a metaphor. That was a man thinking about his property, which was a man who still intended to live. "What do I owe you?" she said. She was loading the supplies into the borrowed saddle pack when a man came up beside her. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a quality to his stillness that was practiced rather than natural. The stillness of someone who had learned to move slowly because slow men were harder to read. "Miss Hart," he said. She turned and looked at him. "You have me at a disadvantage. Victor Rourke." He said it the way men said their names when they expected recognition, and she gave him nothing. "I was sorry to hear about Nathan's situation. Terrible thing." "It is. A property like that sitting empty, no one working it, it's a hard thing for a valley. Things deteriorate." He let that word settle. "I've been meaning to make an offer on that land for some time. Obviously, Nathan wasn't in a position to discuss it when they brought him in, but now that there's someone there who can—" "I'm listening," Evelyn said, because she was. "I'm prepared to offer a fair price. More than fair, given the state the property's in right now. You could take the money back to wherever you came from and—" "And what?" she said. He paused. He looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who had been talking to women for 40 years and had gotten good at predicting when they'd stop. "And start fresh," he said. "Somewhere else." "I see." She tightened the last strap on the pack and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Rourke, Nathan Crowley is alive. He is going to recover, and when he does, he is going to come back to his property, which will be in better shape than it was when he left it. I'm not authorized to sell anything that isn't mine, and I wouldn't do it regardless." She held his gaze. "Is that clear?" Something moved across Victor Rourke's face. Not anger, not exactly. More like the recalculation of a man who had expected to open a door and found a wall instead. "Clear," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Miss Hart." She watched him walk away. She thought, he'll be back. She finished loading the supplies and rode north. Thursday came, and Garrett came with it, and the two of them spent most of the day on horseback moving through the valley looking for Nathan's cattle. They found 6 head scattered across a 2-mile stretch of the north end, grazing the long grass with the mild contentment of animals that had decided freedom agreed with them. Getting them back to the homestead's fenced pasture required more running and more creative language than Evelyn had anticipated, and at one point she looked across the chaos of lowing cattle and alarmed horses to find Garrett watching her with an expression that was as close to amused as she suspected his face got. "You've done this before?" he called. "Not once in my life," she called back. By the time the cattle were in and the gate was latched, the light was going and both of them were tired and covered in the kind of dust that gets into your clothes and requires a day to fully leave. Garrett declined the offer of supper and didn't stay. He came back the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. He never announced he was coming. He simply came, and the rhythm of it established itself the way that practical rhythms do, not through conversation or agreement, just through the repeated fact of it. Sometimes he brought things. Meat he'd taken trapping, or a tool she'd mentioned needing, or once a small keg of nails that she had never asked for but immediately understood the value of. He didn't explain these things, and she didn't make a production of thanking him for them. They worked alongside each other with the ease of people who had separately learned that work went better without excess words, and she found that she trusted his judgment about the land and the property in the way you trusted the judgment of someone who had been paying attention to a place for a long time. He told her one afternoon while they were repairing the eastern fence line together that he'd been working the North Ridge for 6 years, that he'd known Nathan Crowley for 4 of them, that Nathan was a good man, careful and decent and stubborn in the right ways. "Is that so?" she said. "He wrote you good letters," Garrett said, without looking up from the post he was setting. "He showed me one before he sent it, asked if it said the right things. She hadn't known that. She wasn't sure what to do with it." "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him it said what it meant to say." He paused. "That's not nothing, for a letter." Nathan Crowley regained consciousness, properly, recognizably, sustainably, on a Tuesday in late July, 6 weeks after Evelyn had arrived in Harlan's Crossing. Hennessy sent word with a rider, and she rode to town that afternoon with her hands still dirty from the morning's work and her hair under a plain hat, and she sat down in the chair beside his cot and looked at him awake for the first time. He was still thin, still pale, but his eyes were open and clear, and he turned his head when she came in, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been unconscious for 6 weeks and is trying to establish, calmly and without showing how much depends on it, exactly what has happened to his life. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Mr. Crowley, I'm sorry I wasn't at the station." "I know." He swallowed. "The property. The fence is repaired. The barn door is fixed. I found 6 of your cattle. There may be more further north that I haven't gotten to. The chickens mostly took care of themselves." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been out there?" "For 6 weeks." He looked at her, really looked at her, the steady look of a man measuring something. She looked back with equal steadiness. "I don't know what to say," he said. "I don't know if thank you—" "It doesn't need to be thank you," she said. "It needs to be, are you going to fight to get back on your feet, or are you going to lie there and let the fever finish what it started?" Something happened in his face. Something that had been careful became, briefly, something else. "I'm going to get back on my feet," he said. "Good." She stood up. "Then I'll be back Thursday. Hennessy says you might be able to ride in another 2 weeks if you eat and move. We can talk about the rest of it when you're thinking clearly." "Miss Hart." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. "The letter I wrote you," he said. "I meant it, every word." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said again, and went out into the afternoon light, where the mountains were enormous and the sky was wide and the work was still waiting for her, as it always was. She rode north. It was in the second week of August, on an evening when the valley light was amber and low, and the cattle were settled and the house smelled of the stew she'd put on that morning, that she found the note. It was under a rock at the gatepost, a plain piece of paper, folded once, with 2 words written in a hand she didn't recognize. "Sell now." She stood at the gatepost and looked at it for a long time. The valley was quiet around her. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that was still pale where the sun had gone. She folded the note, put it in her pocket, and went inside to eat. She had built enough in 6 weeks to know exactly what she was protecting. She had ridden into this valley with a suitcase and a letter and no plan beyond surviving the first night, and she had made something out of it, something that had shape and weight and stood up when you tested it. She was not going to walk away from it because a man who had never built anything with his own hands thought he could scare her off with a piece of paper. She wrote in her journal that night, "A threat is only a threat until you decide it isn't. I have decided." She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the valley breathe around her, and she was not afraid. The note stayed in her coat pocket for 3 days before she burned it. Not because she was afraid of it. She had decided she wasn't afraid of it, and she was the kind of person who held to decisions once she'd made them. but because she wanted to think about what it meant before she did anything. A threat like that, 2 words on a piece of paper, was not really about the words. It was about what came next. It was a man testing whether she'd flinch, and the answer to that test mattered more than anything she could say about it. She burned it on a Thursday morning in the stove fire, watched the paper curl and go black, and went out to work. Garrett came that afternoon, and she didn't tell him about the note right away. They spent the morning tracking the last of Nathan's missing cattle. 2 more head found in a shallow draw 3 miles northwest, thin but alive. And by the time they'd brought them back and gotten them in with the others, it was past noon and the light had that hard, flat quality that meant the afternoon would be hot. She made coffee, and they stood outside the barn with their cups, and she said, without preamble, "Someone left a note at the gate post, said to sell." Then Garrett looked at her over the rim of his cup. "When?" "Last week, Tuesday evening." "You didn't say anything." "I'm saying something now." He was quiet for a moment. "Rourke? That's my assumption. He's done it before. Left notes, moved fence posts, cut water lines." He set his cup down on the fence rail. "The Alcott brothers, south end of the valley. They found their well salted last spring. A whole season of crops gone. They're still not back from it." This was new information, and she took it in the way she took in information that changed the shape of a problem. Not with alarm, but with the particular attention of someone revising a map. "How many people has he pushed out?" "3 families that I know of. Before Nathan's property, he had his eye on the Keenan place and a widow named Elena Marsh." He looked north, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking, toward the ridge. "Elena didn't sell. She's still there, but her oldest boy left. Couldn't take the pressure. It's just her and the 2 younger ones now." "What does Rourke want with the valley specifically?" "Water rights, mostly. The creek that runs through Nathan's property feeds 3 others before it reaches the western range. Control this land, you control the water. And out here, water is—" He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. Evelyn looked out at the valley. She knew the creek. She'd been hauling water from it every morning for 6 weeks, had learned its moods. The way it ran high in the mornings and lower in the afternoons. The way the bend near the north pasture had undercut its bank and would need reinforcing before winter, or they'd lose a section of pasture. She knew this water the way you knew something you'd relied on every day. The idea of a man like Victor Rourke owning it, deciding who got it and who didn't, controlling an entire valley through the simple arithmetic of thirst, it settled in her chest like a cold stone. "He's not getting it," she said. Garrett picked up his cup. He didn't say anything, but she'd learned enough about him by then to read the quality of his silences. And this one wasn't disagreement. Nathan came home in the last week of August. Hennessy drove him out in a wagon because he still couldn't manage a horse for any distance, and Evelyn met them at the gate and watched Nathan Crowley climb down from the wagon bed slowly and carefully, the way a man climbed down when he was conscious of his own fragility and didn't want to show it but couldn't quite hide it. He was better than he'd been in the doctor's office, some color in his face, some substance returned to his frame. But the fever had taken a tax from him that hadn't been repaid yet, and she could see in the way he moved that he knew it. He stood at his gate and looked at his property. She watched him look at it, the repaired fence line, the barn with its fixed door, the garden she'd started against the south wall of the house, which was small but had been producing greens for 3 weeks, the cattle visible in the north pasture. She hadn't tried to make it look like anything other than what it was, which was a homestead that had been brought back from the edge of collapse by hard, unglamorous work. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "The gate post," he said finally. "You replaced the post. The old one was rotted through at the base. It would have fallen over by October." He nodded slowly. He looked at the garden. "I didn't plant that." "No." Another silence. Hennessy had climbed back up to the wagon seat and was making the deliberate non-expressions of a man giving people their privacy. "Miss Hart," Nathan said, "I owe you. I don't have the right words for what I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," she said, and meant it the way she meant most things, which was precisely. "I came here for a reason. The reason changed shape, but it didn't go away." He turned and looked at her directly, and she saw what she'd seen in the doctor's office. That steadiness, that quality of attention that didn't look away when something was hard. You stayed, he said. I stayed. He held her gaze for another moment, and then he said, I want to see the inside. The first week was difficult in a different way than the previous 6 had been. The work hadn't stopped. If anything, it had added dimensions because now there were 2 people in the house negotiating the ordinary intimacy of shared space. And that was its own kind of labor. Nathan moved through his own home with the careful uncertainty of a man relearning something he'd assumed he knew. And Evelyn gave him room without making a performance of giving him room, which was harder than it sounded. He was not easy to be around at first. Not unpleasant. There was nothing mean in him. She'd been right about that from the letters. But he was proud in the way that sick men were proud, acutely aware of his own limitations in a way that made him quiet and sometimes curt. He tried to work and wore himself out before noon, and refused to admit it until she could see it in the set of his jaw and the way he'd find reasons to sit down. She didn't comment on this. She adjusted her own schedule to leave the lighter tasks available in the afternoons, the things he could do without knowing she'd left them for him. And if he noticed this, he had the grace not to mention it. They ate dinner together and talked about the property, which was the safest territory. What needed doing, in what order, with what materials. It was not the kind of conversation they'd had in letters, which had sometimes gone far afield from practical matters into territory that was harder to name. It was more cautious than that. But she thought that was reasonable. They were 2 people who knew each other through paper, and paper was a narrow bridge, and you crossed narrow bridges carefully. One evening, he asked her why she'd come. They'd been eating in the kind of companionable quiet that had started to feel normal, and then he set his fork down and looked at her and asked the question directly, which was characteristic of him, she was learning. He didn't circle around things he actually wanted to know. Why I answered the advertisement, she said. Why you stayed when you found out what you were walking into. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I'd already used everything I had to get here, she said. I'd given notice at the laundry. I'd paid my train fare. I'd decided. And when you decide something and then the conditions change, you have 2 options. You can undecide it, or you can find out what the decision actually means. She paused. I wanted to find out what it meant. Nathan was quiet for a moment. And what does it mean? I don't know yet, she said. I'm still finding out. He picked his fork back up. There was something in his face that she couldn't entirely read. Something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite something else. Fair enough, he said. Rourke came to the property himself in the 2nd week of September. He came with 2 men behind him, which was not subtle, but was probably intended not to be. He rode up to the gate in the mid-morning when the light was clear and there was no ambiguity about who was there and how many of them. And he sat his horse with the same practiced stillness she'd noticed in town. Nathan came out of the barn when he heard the horses. He was moving better than he had 2 weeks ago. Not at full strength, not close to it, but with a solidity that hadn't been there before. And she saw Rourke take that in. Nathan, Rourke said. Good to see you on your feet. Victor. Nathan's voice was level. What can I do for you? I think you know. Rourke looked around at the property with the considering air of a man appraising something he intended to own, and Evelyn, who was standing near the corner of the house with a bucket she'd been carrying to the garden, watched him do it and said nothing. I made Miss Hart an offer in town a few weeks back. I thought I'd come out and make it properly, man to man. I heard about the offer, Nathan said. The answer was no then. Times change. Not that fast. Rourke smiled, and it was the kind of smile that was entirely about control. The smile of a man who had learned that smiling while being threatening made people feel uncertain in a way that plain threats didn't. Nathan, you've been out of commission for 2 months. Your property was in bad shape when this woman got here. I've been watching this valley for a long time, and I know what it takes to make land like this work. You're behind. You're going into winter behind, and I'm offering you a way out of that. I don't need a way out, Nathan said. I need you to get off my land. One of the men behind Rourke shifted slightly, and Evelyn said, Mr. Rourke. Both men looked at her. She hadn't moved from where she was standing. The property's been surveyed, she said. The deed's registered in Harlan's Crossing. The water rights are documented. I spent some of my time here going through Nathan's papers, and everything is in order. She looked at Rourke with the same steadiness she'd have given anyone making a business proposition she was about to decline. I mention this because sometimes men in your position assume that a property in visible disrepair is a property whose legal standing is also in disrepair. It isn't. So whatever you're thinking about the nature of your options here, I'd encourage you to factor that in. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was harder to read than the smile. Something that had more edges. "You did your homework," he said. "I did." He looked back at Nathan. "Think about it, Nathan. The offer won't stay open forever." "It's already closed," Nathan said. Rourke turned his horse. His two men followed. They rode west, and Evelyn watched until they were gone from sight, and then she picked up her bucket and continued to the garden. Nathan came to stand beside her. "You went through my papers." "I did. I hope that's all right." "It's all right." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew about the water rights." "I knew it mattered. I looked into what mattered." He picked up the second bucket, the empty one she'd set down, and filled it from the rain barrel. They worked in the garden for a while without talking, which had become a language of its own, a way of being alongside each other that didn't require the labor of words. Eventually, Nathan said, "He's going to come back, not like that. Another way." "I know. I want you to know that I'm not going to sell, whatever he does. I'm not going to sell." She looked at him. The afternoon light was on his face, and he looked tired, still, the residual tiredness of a man who had been very sick and wasn't done recovering, but there was something underneath it that was solid. "I know that too," she said. 3 days later, the Keenan farm burned, not the house. Daniel Keenan had gotten his family out, had seen the smoke from the barn first, and had the presence of mind to get his wife and children clear before the fire caught the roof. But the barn and the grain stores and most of the equipment that had been inside. Daniel came to Nathan's property the next morning on foot, covered in soot, his eyes red-rimmed and his hands shaking with the particular trembling of someone who has passed through terror and come out the other side into a kind of cold, exhausted clarity. Evelyn made him sit down and brought him coffee and let him drink half of it before she said anything. "Who saw it start?" she asked. "Nobody. It was after midnight. I smelled it before I heard it." Daniel Keenan was a compact, dark-haired man in his mid-30s, the kind of man who is usually in motion and looked displaced when sitting. "It wasn't lightning. There wasn't a storm. It started in the middle of the barn and worked outward, which is not how a fire starts from the inside." "You think it was set?" Nathan said. "I know it was set." He looked up. "I talked to Frank Alcott last week, one of the brothers on the south end. He said 2 of Rourke's men had been riding the perimeter of their property, just riding it, slow, like they were measuring something. Frank told them to clear off, and they did. But they came back." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the note under the gatepost. 2 words. She was thinking about Garrett's description of the salted well, the cut water lines, the families who had left. "Is your family all right?" she said. "They're all right, shaken. My youngest won't stop crying." He set his cup down. "I can't rebuild without the equipment. I can't afford new equipment. And I can't run a farm without—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'm not going to sell him my land. I know that's what he wants. I'm not going to do it." "No," Evelyn said. "You're not." Nathan looked at her. She looked back at him, and then she looked at Daniel Keenan, who had come here because he had nowhere else to go and because he had recognized instinctively that this property was the one in the valley that had held. "Stay here tonight," she said. "I'll send word to Garrett Hale and Elena Marsh and the Alcott brothers. We need to talk." They gathered 2 days later in Nathan's barn, which was the largest meeting space in the valley that wasn't in town, and Evelyn had made sure that town wasn't involved. This was a valley matter, and the fewer people in Harlan's Crossing who knew about it, the better. She had no illusions about whether Rourke had ears in town, because a man building a territorial empire without ears would be an unusual man. 7 people came, Daniel Keenan and his wife Mary, who was quieter than her husband but listened to everything. Elena Marsh, who was 50-something and tough in the specific way of someone who had been dealing with hard things alone for a long time. The Alcott brothers, Frank and Samuel, who were different enough from each other that it was hard to believe they were siblings, but who moved with the same careful deliberateness. A veteran named Cole Briggs, who had land on the northeast end of the valley that Evelyn hadn't known about, and who had shown up because Elena had told him. And Fran Dodd, the other widow Garrett had mentioned, who arrived last and sat in the back and said almost nothing for the first half of the meeting, and then said the most useful thing anyone said. Garrett was there too, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not leading but present, which she had come to understand was his particular way of being useful. Evelyn stood in the middle of the barn and didn't waste their time with preamble. "Victor Rourke has been pushing this valley for 2 years," she said. "The Keenan barn is the most visible thing he's done, but it's not the only thing. You all know pieces of what's happened. I want to talk about what we know together, because I think there's more of a pattern here than any one of us can see from our own property." What emerged over the next hour was, in fact, a pattern. It was not complicated, as patterns went. It was the pattern of a man with resources and patience who picked at the edges of a community until the community shrank to a size he could manage. He'd started with the weakest holdings, the ones whose owners had least margin for error, a widow with no help, a family already struggling with a bad harvest. He had used rumors first, then notes, then physical damage, always leaving enough ambiguity that nothing could be pinned to him directly. The well salting had been witnessed by no one. The note on Evelyn's gatepost was handwritten and unsigned. "He's careful," Frank Alcott said. "He doesn't do anything you can prove." "Not yet," Evelyn said. "But he's escalating. A note is not a barn fire. Those are different in kind, not just in degree. At some point he'll do something that isn't deniable." "At some point might be too late for some of us," Mary Keenan said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken, and the room gave her the attention she'd earned by waiting. "We don't have a barn anymore. My children are sleeping in the house with the tools because there's nowhere else to put them. We can't wait for him to make a mistake." Silence. Fran Dodd, from the back of the barn, said, "What if we stop being separate?" Everyone looked at her. She was a small woman, gray-haired, with the unsentimental directness of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about how things sounded. "We've all been acting like this is each of our own problem. Our fence, our well, our barn. What if it isn't? What if we treat it like it's all one property?" "We can't patrol each other's land," Samuel Alcott said. "We each have our own work. I'm not talking about patrols. I'm talking about if something happens on one property, we all know about it the same day. If someone sees Rourke's men riding the perimeter of someone's land, that information goes to everyone. If someone needs help rebuilding, we all show up." She paused. "He's been winning because we've been alone. What if we stopped being alone?" The room was quiet again. Evelyn looked around it, at the faces, at the quality of attention in each of them. These were people who were tired and scared and hadn't fully admitted either of those things to themselves. And they were listening to Fran Dodd say something that was simple, but that had the weight of something true. "That's exactly right," Evelyn said. "Hold on. They worked out the details over the following week. It wasn't a formal arrangement yet. There were no papers, no oaths, nothing that would look like organization to anyone watching from outside. It was simpler than that, a set of agreements between neighbors who had decided to act like neighbors. If you saw something, you told someone. If someone's property was threatened, you sent for the others. If someone needed labor they couldn't manage alone, the others would come." The Keenan barn was the first test of it. They rebuilt it in 4 days, all of them, working in shifts, with material the Alcott brothers contributed and skills that turned out to be distributed across the group. In useful ways, Cole Briggs had been a carpenter before the war, and his knowledge of framing transformed what would have been a rough structure into something solid. Elena Marsh could drive nails faster than anyone Evelyn had ever seen, which she explained was because she'd built most of her own house. Nathan worked alongside them, still not at full strength, still having to stop more often than he wanted to, but working. Evelyn watched him work and saw something return to him that the fever had taken. Not just strength, but a sense of himself as a man who did things, who built things, who belonged to a piece of land and intended to stay. Garrett said almost nothing through any of it, but he was always where he was needed, which Evelyn had come to understand was its own kind of speech. The night the barn was finished, they ate together in the Keenan yard. Whatever everyone had brought, spread across the tailgate of the Alcott wagon, eaten standing or sitting on whatever was available. It was not a celebration so much as a mutual exhale. Children ran in the dark between the adults' legs. Mary Keenan laughed at something Daniel said, the first time Evelyn had heard her laugh, and it changed her face entirely. Nathan came to stand beside Evelyn at the edge of the lamplight. "You did this," he said quietly. Fran Dodd did this. Fran said the thing. You made it happen. He looked out at the people in the yard. I've been in this valley 4 years, and I've never been inside the Keenan house. That's not something I'm proud of. She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too easy or too complicated, and she had learned that those were the moments where silence was the most honest response. I'm going to be all right, he said. Not the way people said it when they were trying to convince themselves. The way you said it when you'd made a decision. Physically, I'm going to get back to where I was. Hennessy thinks another month. You're already most of the way there. I know. A pause. I want to be useful to what you're building here, not just on my own land. She looked at him. In the lamplight, his face was serious and still and entirely sincere, and she thought again about the letters, about the careful and deliberate honesty of the man who had written them, and she thought that whatever she'd expected to find at the end of that correspondence, she hadn't expected this particular kind of person who meant what he said and said what he meant and didn't make a performance of either. You're already useful, she said. PM. 2 weeks after the barn raising, Rourke made his next move. He didn't come himself this time. 3 of his men showed up at the Alcott property before dawn and drove off 12 head of cattle. The Alcotts found the tracks in the morning and followed them west far enough to know where they were going, and then they turned back and came to Nathan's place, and within half a day, every homesteader in the valley knew. Frank Alcott wanted to ride west and take the cattle back by force. Samuel was less sure. You ride onto Rourke's range with guns out, Evelyn said, and you give him exactly the excuse he needs. He has 40 men. We have 7 families. So we just let him take them, Frank said. No. She looked around the group. They had gathered again, this time in the open, in the yard, because there was no pretense left to maintain. We go to the sheriff in Harlan's Crossing. We document the tracks, the direction, the timing. We make a formal report. The sheriff's in Rourke's pocket, Cole Briggs said, and there were nods around the group that told her this was not a new observation. Maybe. But a report on file is a record. If Rourke's men take cattle and we have a report on file, and then later something worse happens, that report is part of a pattern. You build a case the way you build a fence, one post at a time. She looked at Frank. I know it's not satisfying. I know you want your cattle back today. But if we ride west, we lose the only ground we have. Frank looked at her for a long moment. He was angry. It was visible in every line of him. And she didn't begrudge him the anger because it was a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. But anger without strategy was just noise, and they couldn't afford noise right now. The cattle can be replaced, Samuel Alcott said quietly to his brother. The land can't. Frank exhaled. All right, he said. We file the report. She went with them into town. She sat with Frank Alcott in the sheriff's office while Frank explained what had happened, and she watched the sheriff, a broad, sandy-haired man named Cutter, who had the particular quality of attentiveness of someone making sure he didn't say anything that could be used against him. And she made notes on a piece of paper she'd brought, which she held openly on her knee, which she suspected was the thing that made Sheriff Cutter slightly less evasive than he might otherwise have been. Men who knew they were being written down tended to be more careful. They filed the report. It went into a ledger. Whether it would ever be looked at again was another question, but it existed, which was more than it had before. On the way back out to the valley, Frank Alcott rode beside her in silence for a mile before he said, How long do you think we can hold? She thought about that honestly. She thought about the note under the gatepost and the Keenan barn and the Alcott cattle and the pattern of a man with resources and patience and no conscience to speak of. As long as we need to, she said, which means as long as we stay together. He nodded once, and they rode the rest of the way in silence, with the mountains enormous all around them and the creek running cold and the valley holding its own quiet under the enormous Montana sky, waiting to see what it would take. Nathan started working full days in the first week of October, and the property felt different with him in it, steadier, more occupied, the way a house felt different when all its rooms were being used. He was not all the way back. He still tired faster than he wanted to, still had mornings when the residual damage from the fever showed in the stiffness of his movements and the care with which he started the day. But he worked, and he worked hard, and he did it with the same methodical attention she'd recognized in the letters, in the careful descriptions of fence mending and chimney packing that had told her what kind of man he was before she knew his face. They fell into a rhythm, the two of them, that was different from the rhythm she'd had alone. Not worse, different. He took the heavier work without being asked, not because he thought she couldn't do it, but because he had the strength for it now, and the strength needed to be used. She took the organizational work, the correspondence, the tracking of everything that needed tracking, supplies, the agreement with the neighbors, the ongoing documentation she was building in a ledger of her own. They didn't step on each other. They had, she thought, complementary architectures, the way two different tools could work on the same piece of wood without conflicting. One evening, she found him reading the letters she'd written him, the originals, the ones he'd received in Billings before she came. He had them out on the table, and he was reading with the same deliberate attention she'd imagined when she'd written them. And when he heard her come in, he didn't put them away. "I've read them before," he said. "I wanted to read them again now that I know you." She sat across from him. And you're more yourself in them than I expected." He set them down. "Most people are less themselves in letters. They edit." "I didn't have much left to lose," she said. It seemed like the wrong time to be careful. He smiled at that. A small smile, but a real one. The kind that reached his eyes, and she realized she hadn't seen him smile that way before, and that it changed his face in the same way Mary Keenan's laugh had changed hers, from a face you could read to a face you wanted to. "I should have been at the station," he said. Came out of nowhere, or seemed to. She suspected it had been sitting in him for a while. "You were sick." "I know, I still should have—" He stopped. "I wanted to be there. I'd thought about it 100 times. What I'd say. Whether I'd say anything, or whether I'd just—" He stopped again. "Whether you'd just what?" she said. He looked at her. "Whether I'd just be glad you were real." She held that for a moment. Outside, the wind was coming down from the north with the first real bite of autumn in it, and the fire in the stove was doing its work, and the valley was dark and enormous all around the small, warm house. She thought about 8 months of letters and a train station, and a note under a gatepost, and a man who had asked his friend whether his letter said what it meant to say. "I'm real," she said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." They didn't say anything else about it that night. But something had shifted, the way things shifted when you finally said the thing you'd been carrying around the edges of for a while, and the house felt different after that. Fuller, somehow, in a way she couldn't have precisely named but didn't need to. She wrote in her journal before she slept, "There is something here. I don't know what to call it yet. I'm not sure I need to." The valley was quiet. Somewhere to the west, Victor Rourke had 40 men in a plan, and winter was coming, and everything they'd built together was fragile in the way that anything real was fragile. But it was also solid in the way that things were solid when they'd been made out of actual work and actual honesty, and that kind of solid, she had learned, was harder to break than it looked. She closed the journal, she put out the lamp. Outside, the first frost of the season was settling over the valley like a held breath. The frost that settled over the valley that first October night did not leave. It came back each morning after that, heavier each time, and by the second week of October the grass in the north pasture had gone stiff and silver before sunrise, and the creek ran with a skin of ice along its edges that melted by noon but came back thicker the next day. Winter in this part of Montana was not a season that arrived. It was a siege, patient and inevitable, and the homesteaders who had survived previous years knew how to read its approach the way sailors read weather, in the small signs that added up to a direction. Evelyn had never wintered in Montana. She had grown up in Ohio, spent the last years in Billings, which had its own cold but not like this. Not this wide, pressing cold that came down from the north with nothing to stop it and made the mountains look closer than they were. She watched the experienced people around her, and she learned from what she watched. Nathan showed her how to pack the windowsills against draft, how to bank the stove fire at night so it held until morning without burning through the wood too fast, how to check the cattle twice a day in cold weather rather than once, because cold had a way of finding the animal that was already struggling and finishing the job. She absorbed all of it and filed it alongside the fence mending and the water hauling and the 100 other practical competencies she'd been accumulating since July, building a vocabulary of this land that she hadn't had when she arrived and couldn't afford not to have now. She also watched the valley. The agreement among the homesteaders had changed the texture of daily life in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. People move differently now. Not with less caution, but with a different kind of caution. The caution of people who are watching a broader perimeter instead of just their own fence line. If Samuel Alcott rode the South Ridge and saw something that didn't look right, word reached Nathan's property by the following morning. If Elena Marsh's water line froze and she needed help thawing it, she sent her youngest boy to the Keenans, and the Keenans sent to whoever was closest. The information moved through the valley like water finding its own level. And what it told Evelyn, cumulatively, was that Rourke's men were still out there, still riding the edges, still watching, still measuring, but that they had slowed down after the Alcott cattle incident and the formal report filed with Sheriff Cutter. She didn't think the slowing meant retreat. She thought it meant adjustment. "He's waiting for winter," Garrett said one morning. He'd come down from the North Ridge earlier than usual, and there was something in his face when he came in that made her set down what she was doing and give him her full attention. He accepted coffee and stood near the stove, which he usually didn't. He usually stood away from heat sources, a habit of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and found enclosed warmth slightly excessive. The fact that he was standing near the stove told her the temperature on the ridge was already serious. "What did you see?" she said. 3 riders on the western approach. They weren't moving like men who were going somewhere. They were moving like men who were counting something. Counting what? Properties? Access points? Probably figuring out which holdings are going to be most isolated once the snow comes. He drank his coffee. In deep winter, the Marsh property is the most cut off. That creek crossing she uses goes under in February. Too much ice to ford safely, and the alternate route adds 2 hours. He paused. The Phelps property is the same, and Phelps is alone. Evelyn hadn't had much contact with Phelps. The old man maintained his reputation for privacy with the diligence of someone who had worked at it for a long time, but she had ridden past his land twice and understood that it sat at a critical point on the northern water line, the line that fed down through Nathan's property and then continued to the Keenans. If Rourke controlled Phelps' land, he controlled that upper section of water with it. "I need to go talk to Phelps," she said. "He won't talk to you." "He might." Garrett looked at her with the expression he had when he was revising a previous assessment. "He won't talk to me either. I've tried." "I'm not you." She poured her coffee. "What do you know about him?" "He came here about 12 years ago, before the town was much of anything. He built his own place, did his own surveying, registered his own claim before the county office was even set up properly. He's self-sufficient to a degree that most people find excessive." A pause. "His wife died about 8 years ago. He had a son who left maybe 5 years back. Nobody knows where." She thought about that. A man who'd been self-sufficient for 12 years, alone for 8, whose only family had gone. That was a particular kind of person. Not necessarily hostile, possibly just defended. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. "I'll go Thursday," she said. She went alone. She left Nathan working the south fence and took the bay mare north, and then cut west toward the ridge where Phelps's property sat above the creek, in a position that was strategically excellent and clearly not accidental. A man who knew what he was doing when he staked his claim, who'd looked at the land and understood its logic before anyone else was paying attention. The house was small but tight, the kind of construction that said nothing decorative and everything structural. A man came out of it before she reached the gate, and he stood with his arms at his sides and watched her come with the expressionless attention of someone who was not surprised, but also not pleased. Josephus Phelps was somewhere past 60, white-bearded, with eyes that were a pale, clear gray that had the quality of water you could see all the way to the bottom of. He did not say hello. "Mr. Phelps," she said, "I'm Evelyn Hart. I'm staying at the Crowley property on the south end." "I know who you are," he said. "Then you might know why I'm here." "I might." He looked at her for a long moment. "You can come in if you want. I've got coffee on." He poured coffee into mugs that were plain and clean and sat across from her at a table that had one chair on each side, which was all the furniture the room required and probably all it had ever had. The house smelled of wood smoke and something she thought was pine resin, a clean smell that suited the space. "Rourke's going to come for my land in the winter," Phelps said, before she'd started whatever she'd prepared to say. He said it the way you stated a fact about weather. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." I've been watching him work the valley for 2 years. He's systematic. Phelps wrapped his hands around his mug. His hands were large and scarred in ways that suggested a long history of manual work. What is it you're proposing? She told him about the agreement, the information sharing, the mutual response, the documentation. She told him about the Keenan barn and the Alcott cattle and the report filed with Cutter. She told him about what Garrett had seen on the western approach that morning. She told him all of it plainly, without embellishment, because she suspected he was a man who would value plainness over persuasion. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I've been alone for a long time," he said. "It suits me." "I'm not asking you to stop being alone," she said. "I'm asking you to let us know if something happens, and to know that if it does, we'll come." He looked into his mug. "My wife used to say I was the most stubborn man she'd ever met." Was she right? Something moved across his face that might have been the memory of a smile. "Mostly." He looked up. "What do you need from me specifically?" "Eyes on the western approach from the ridge. You can see more from here than anyone else in the valley. And if Rourke's men come to your property, any approach, any contact, we need to know the same day." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "My son left because he couldn't take the isolation. Said I'd rather own a piece of land than be part of a human world." He stood up and took his mug to the small window and looked out at his property, at the creek below and the western ridge beyond it. Maybe he wasn't wrong. She didn't answer that because it wasn't a question and it didn't need a response. She waited. "All right," he said. "I'll let you know what I see." November arrived, and with it a cold that was no longer a suggestion but a statement, and Rourke made his next move in the first week of it. This time it wasn't property damage. This time it was a document. A man rode into Harlan's Crossing from the county seat carrying papers that he filed with the county recorder's office, and within 2 days word had reached the valley that Victor Rourke had submitted a claim asserting prior water rights to the creek system that ran through 6 of the 7 homesteads. The claim was based on a survey conducted, according to the document, in 1878, 3 years before most of the valley's current settlers had arrived. Nathan came in from town with the news, and his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. He put the copy of the document he'd gotten from the recorder's office on the table and stood back with his arms crossed and said, "Tell me what you see." She read it carefully. It took her a while because it was dense with language designed to sound more certain than it was. The kind of legal prose that used specificity as camouflage. When she finished, she read it again. "The survey date," she said. 1878. "Who conducted it?" "Man named Aldridge. Says here he was a county-appointed surveyor." "Is there a county record of his appointment?" Nathan looked at her. "I don't know." "We need to know." She set the document down. "A survey can be falsified. The appointment record is harder to falsify because it would have to exist in the county books before Rourke needed it. If there's no record of Aldridge being appointed in 1878, then the survey is fraudulent. Then the survey is at least questionable, which might be enough to contest the claim." She looked at him. "I need to go to the county seat." "That's 3 days' ride." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll go with you." "No, you need to stay here. If something happens while we're both gone—" She didn't finish the sentence because they both knew what the end of it was. "Garrett," he said, "I'll ask him." She was already folding the document to put in her coat. "I need you to tell every family in the valley about this claim today. They need to know. They also need to know not to panic because panicking won't help, and Rourke is probably counting on it." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. That steady, direct look she'd come to know as his way of paying full attention. "You know," he said, "when I wrote that advertisement, I was thinking I don't know what I was thinking about. A practical arrangement, someone to help with the property." "I remember," she said. "You were very honest about your intentions." "I was." He paused. "I wasn't thinking about this. I wasn't thinking about someone who could read a fraudulent land claim and know immediately where the weak point was. Most people don't put that in their advertisements." "No." He almost smiled. "They don't." She left the next morning. The county seat was a town called Bridger's Fall, 3 days northeast, and she made it in 2.5 because the weather held, and she pushed the horse harder than was strictly comfortable. The county recorder's office was a small building adjacent to the courthouse, staffed by a single clerk who was meticulous and who respected, she could tell, anyone else who was meticulous. She spent the better part of 2 days going through records. She found the survey ledgers for 1875 through 1880. She found the appointment records for county surveyors. She found the name Aldridge twice, once in 1880, appointed for a survey east of Bridger's Fall, and once in an 1876 record that was something else entirely. There was no record of a county appointment for any survey in the Harlan's Valley area in 1878. There was no record of any survey conducted there at all before 1880. She copied everything by hand, every relevant entry, in her careful and legible script, and she had the clerk sign and date his initials to the copies as verification that they were accurate transcriptions of the originals. He did this without complaint and with the gravity of a man who understood what official signatures meant. She rode back in 2.5 days as well, arriving at the homestead in the late afternoon of the 6th day to find Nathan in the barn and Garrett's horse at the rail, which meant something had happened. She put her horse away first. Then she went inside. Go. Garrett's face told her before he spoke. He had that specific stillness he had when he was controlling his expression more than usual, the stillness of bad news being managed. Fran Dodd's place, he said. What happened? They came at night, 3 nights ago. Not fire this time. He paused. They beat her hired man badly enough that he left. Took what cash she had in the house. Told her the next visit would be worse. Evelyn stood very still. She wasn't hurt, Garrett continued. She was in the house when it happened, and they didn't touch her. But her hired man is gone, and she's alone, and she's 62 years old, and it's November. Where is she now? Keenan Place. Mary brought her over. Evelyn set her documents on the table. She was aware of a cold quality settling in her. Not the cold of the weather outside, but the cold of something that had been running through degrees and had now reached the one it had always been heading toward. This was what came after the note, and the barn fire, and the stolen cattle, and the fraudulent claim. This was Rourke deciding that patience was no longer his preferred instrument. He's changed tactics, she said. Yes, because he knows we're organized. The property damage wasn't working because we were helping each other rebuild. So he's going after people directly now. She looked at Garrett. He wants someone to break. He thinks if one person breaks, sells, leaves, stops fighting, the rest will follow. Probably right about that, Nathan said quietly. He'd been sitting at the table, and she hadn't looked at him directly since she came in, but she looked at him now. His face was tight. If Fran leaves, it changes the valley. Her land is right in the middle of the water line. Fran's not leaving, Evelyn said. She's 62, and she just had 3 men in her house in the middle of the night. I know what happened to her. She picked up the documents she'd brought from Bridger's Fall. And I know what I found at the county recorder's office. There is no legitimate 1878 survey. The record doesn't exist. Rourke's claim is built on a document that was fabricated. She set the copies on the table. Which means he's getting scared. You don't commit document fraud if you think you're winning cleanly. Nathan looked at the papers. Garrett looked at them. Neither of them said anything for a moment. We take this to a lawyer, Nathan said. Get the claim contested formally. Yes. And we do it fast before the court schedules a hearing on his claim. If we can get a contestation filed with the supporting documentation from the county records. She stopped. Can you get to Bridger's Fall before the end of the month? You and Frank Alcott, since the claim affects his water too. A lawyer named Barrett in Bridger's Fall. The clerk mentioned him, said he was the one you wanted for land matters. I can leave Monday, Nathan said. Good. She sat down. The writing had been long and she was tired in her bones, and she let herself feel it for a moment, just briefly, before she put it away. How is Fran? Shaken, Garrett said. She's not saying she'll leave, but she's shaken. I'll go see her tomorrow. She looked at both of them. What else? Phelps, Garrett said. He's been watching the Western Ridge like you asked. He sent word 2 days ago. Rourke's built a new camp out there. Bigger than what he had before. More men. The valley was quiet around the house. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like something breathing, very slowly. Then we need to move faster than he does, Evelyn said. She went to the Keenan farm the next morning and sat with Fran Dodd for 2 hours. Fran was a woman who had gotten through a great deal in her life without making much noise about it, and she was getting through this the same way, with a quietness that could have been mistaken for fragility, but wasn't. She drank her coffee and she listened when Evelyn told her about the fraudulent survey and about Nathan going to Bridger's Fall, and she asked 2 or 3 precise questions that told Evelyn she was processing rather than shutting down. "They took my cash box," Fran said. "Not a fortune, but everything I had liquid until the spring. We'll cover what you need until spring, all of us together. I'm not charity." "No, you're a neighbor." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "The distinction matters." Fran was quiet for a moment. "That boy they beat, Marcus his name was. He's been working for me for 2 years. He was a good worker." She looked at her hands. "He didn't deserve that." "No, he didn't." "I'm angry," Fran said, as if this surprised her slightly. "I keep thinking I should be scared, and I am scared, but mostly I'm just angry." "That's the right response," Evelyn said. In the second week of November, Cole Briggs called a meeting that Evelyn hadn't organized, which told her something important about what was happening in the valley. That the organization was no longer dependent on her specifically, that it had taken root and was running on its own energy now. He sent word to every household, and they gathered at his place on the northeast end, and he stood in his own yard with his arms crossed and said, plainly, that they needed to talk about what they were going to do when Rourke stopped being subtle. "He's been subtle for 2 years, Samuel Alcott said. "That seems to be changing." "It's changing," Cole confirmed. "Marcus Lead, Fran's hired man, I talked to him before he left. He said 3 men came in through the back of the property, which means they'd scouted it in advance. They knew the layout. They knew where the cash box was. That's not a spontaneous intimidation. That's a planned operation." Elena Marsh said, "So what do we do when they come for one of us directly?" Cole looked around the group. He was a deliberate man, someone who chose his words with the care of a former soldier who had seen what happened when orders were given badly. "We go, all of us. Whatever time of day or night, if someone sends a signal, we ride." "How do we signal?" Mary Keenan asked. "Fire on the ridge," Garrett said. He'd been standing at the back as usual, and everyone turned to look at him. "I can see every property in the valley from the north ridge. If I see a fire where there shouldn't be one, I'll ride for the nearest farm. We build a chain from there." "And if it's in the middle of a blizzard," Frank Alcott said. "Then we do the best we can," Garrett said. "There's no perfect system. We do what we can do." Evelyn had been listening to all of this, and she spoke now. "This is the right direction. But I want us to be honest about something." She looked around the group. "If we ride to each other's aid when Rourke's men come, and we should, we need to think about what that means in practice. We're not soldiers. We're farmers and ranchers and 1 former carpenter and 2 widows. We can't fight trained hired guns on their terms." "What are our terms then?" Daniel Keenan asked. "Numbers and knowledge. We know this valley better than any of Rourke's men. We know where the creek crosses, where the ground goes soft, where the ridge line can be used as cover. We know each other's properties. They don't." She paused. "We also have something else. Documentation. Nathan and Frank are in Bridger's Fall right now getting a legal contestation filed on the water rights claim. If Rourke's claim fails, and I believe it will fail, because it's fraudulent, then his entire legal justification for being in this valley goes with it." "How long does that take?" Elena asked. "Months, probably, maybe longer." She didn't soften it. "Which is why we need to hold until it happens. Hold together, hold firm, don't give him what he wants, which is for one of us to break." The group was quiet. She looked at them. At the faces that had become familiar to her over the last 4 months, the faces of people she hadn't known existed when she'd stepped off the train in Harlan's Crossing and stood on the platform looking for a man with a blue kerchief. What she felt toward them was something she couldn't have entirely named. Not love, not exactly, but something in the same family. The particular regard you had for people you'd chosen to be accountable to. "Nobody breaks," Cole Briggs said. It wasn't a question. Nobody answered, which was the same as an answer. No. The attack on Elena Marsh's property came 3 weeks later, on a night when the temperature had dropped to something that made the air itself seem brittle, and it came not with men in the house, but with something worse. They cut the water line that ran from the creek to her property. Not just cut it, removed a section entirely, a 20-foot span that would take days to replace, and materials she didn't have on hand. Without running water in winter, a homestead was in serious trouble within 48 hours. Animals needed water. Pipes that ran dry and cold this deep could freeze and crack. A farm without water in a Montana winter in November was not a farm that could survive the season. Phelps saw the men leave from the ridge and sent his signal. Not a fire in the end, but a lamp flashed 3 times in the direction of Garrett's usual position, a system they'd worked out between them when fire seemed too conspicuous in conditions that dry. Garrett rode for the marsh property before dawn. By morning, there were 4 more people there, and by the following day they had the line repaired. But the repair cost them time and material and sleep that none of them had to spare. And they all knew that Rourke had many men, and they had 7 families, and that he could do this again and again on a rotation that wore them down while he lost almost nothing. Elena Marsh said, when the work was done and everyone was sitting in her kitchen with hot coffee thawing their fingers, "We can't keep repairing." Nobody argued with her. "He's going to keep coming until something stops him decisively," she said. "Not until we fix whatever he breaks. Until something changes so fundamentally that breaking things stops being useful to him." "The legal challenge," Evelyn said, "if it works. And in time." Elena looked at her. She was not an unkind woman, but she was a woman who had been facing difficulty alone for a long time and had developed a realistic assessment of what hoping too hard cost you. What if it doesn't work fast enough? It was the question underneath everything, and it sat in the kitchen with them while the wind threw itself against the windows, and the coffee steamed, and nobody had an immediate answer for it. December came in hard. Nathan returned from Bridger's Fall with a lawyer named Barrett's verbal assurance that the contestation was strong and would be filed before the end of the month. The fraudulent survey was the cornerstone. Without an official appointment record, the document couldn't be substantiated, and Barrett had found 2 additional discrepancies in the language of the claim that suggested it had been written by someone who was not actually familiar with the 1878 county survey standards. "He thinks we have a real case," Nathan told her. "He thinks it might take 3 months, maybe 4, but he thinks we can win it, 3 or 4 months." January, February, March. The deepest part of a Montana winter, the part when the valley would be most isolated and Rourke's pressure would be hardest to resist. She told the valley. She told them all of it, including the timeline. What she did not expect was what Cole Briggs said after she finished. "Then we make it to spring," he said. Simply, without drama. "That's what I'm saying. No. I mean, that's the mission. Not win, not fight Rourke to a standstill. Just make it to spring with everyone still on their land. That's the thing we're holding for." She looked at him. He was right, and it was the kind of rightness that simplified everything. Reduce the enormous and complicated problem to something you could hold in your head and navigate by. Make it to spring. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." It was the night of December 14th when things changed beyond repair. Phelps's signal came at 2 in the morning. Not a lamp this time, but a rifle shot. 2 quick reports. The signal for immediate danger, the one they'd agreed on for situations where there was no time for anything subtle. Garrett was already moving by the time the second shot died in the frozen air, and within 20 minutes the chain had been pulled. Garrett to the Keenans, Keenans to Evelyn, Evelyn sending Nathan north toward Elena, while she and Garrett rode west toward Phelps's property. They found Fran Dodd in the road. She had been coming from the marsh property where she'd been staying. It had seemed safer, more company, and Elena had wanted her close. She had been riding home to collect some things she needed, and she had encountered 3 of Rourke's men on the western road, and they had stopped her. The details came out in fragments, there in the dark and the cold with the horses breathing steam around them. She was not injured in any way that showed, but she was shaking in a way that was not from the cold, a deep and involuntary shaking that was the body's honest response to terror that the mind had managed to contain. "They told me to carry a message," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. They said if the valley doesn't clear out by the 1st of January, Rourke's going to stop being patient. "What does that mean specifically?" Garrett said. "They didn't say specifically." She looked at Evelyn. They didn't have to. Garrett took Fran to the marsh property, and Evelyn rode on to Phelps' place, where she found the old man standing at his gate with a rifle and an expression of cold fury that was the most emotion she'd ever seen on his face. "They were on my land," he said, 3 men, on my land, at 2 in the morning. Did they do anything to the property? Not tonight. Tonight they were sending the message. He looked west, toward the ridge where Rourke's camp sat in the darkness. I've had this land for 12 years. My wife is buried on this land. His voice was flat and precise and entirely clear. They are not going to take it. She stood beside him in the frozen dark and looked west, too, toward the place where Victor Rourke had 40 men and a plan, and the patience of someone who believed that eventually everything broke if you hit it hard enough. No, she said, they're not. She called the meeting for the following morning, and this time there were no absent faces. Even Phelps came down from his ridge, which everyone noticed and nobody commented on. They stood in Nathan's barn in the gray December morning light, with their breath misting in the cold, and Evelyn told them about Fran's encounter on the road and the message and what it meant. He's given us a deadline, she said, January 1st, which means he's done waiting. He's going to come at us hard in January, and he's going to do it in the middle of the worst weather of the year, when we're most isolated and most exhausted and least able to respond. So what do we do? Daniel Keenan said. She had been thinking about this since 2 in the morning, riding through the dark, cold, working its way through her coat and into her bones. She had been thinking about what Elena Marsh had said, that they couldn't keep repairing, that something had to change fundamentally. She had been thinking about Garrett's knowledge of the terrain and Phelps's position on the ridge, and the legal contestation moving through the county court system. She had been thinking about what it meant to stop waiting for Rourke to do the next thing, and to decide what happened next yourself. We stopped being reactive, she said. He's been setting the pace, and we've been running to keep up. We stopped running. How? Cole Briggs asked. She looked at Garrett, who had been leaning against the wall as usual, but who was looking at her now with the specific alertness of someone who already knew the shape of what was coming. We have information he doesn't have, she said. We know his camp is on the western ridge. We know how many men he has, roughly. We know his patterns, when they ride, where they go, what they're watching. Phelps has been watching that ridge for a month. She paused. And we know the legal situation. The contestation is filed. The documentation is real. If Rourke does something visible enough, something that can't be attributed to unknown persons in the dark, then Barrett can use it. Sheriff Cutter might ignore small things, but even Cutter can't ignore something the county court is actively looking at. You're saying we draw him out, Nathan said. I'm saying we make him choose between staying patient and doing something he can't deny. She looked at all of them. He thinks we're scared. He thinks the deadline is going to work. If we show him it isn't, if we show him clearly and undeniably that we're still here and still organized and not going anywhere, he's going to have to decide what he's willing to do in front of witnesses. The barn was quiet. Elena Marsh said, That's a risk. If he decides he's willing to do quite a lot in front of witnesses, yes, Evelyn said. It's a risk. She didn't qualify it further because these were people who could assess risk for themselves and didn't need it managed for them. The silence stretched. Then Cole Briggs pushed himself off the barn wall and straightened his coat and said, in the unhurried voice of a man who had made decisions in bad conditions before, All right, what do we need to do? They had 3 weeks before January 1st. They spent them preparing in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible things were deliberate, improvements to each property, additional livestock moving in from the range, a systematic shoring up of everything that could be used as evidence that these people intended to stay. The documentation she'd been building all autumn grew. A log of every incident, every rider seen on the perimeter, every message and note and act of damage. All of it dated and witnessed and signed by more than one person wherever possible. When Barrett's first letter arrived from Bridger's Fall saying the contestation had been formally accepted and a hearing scheduled for March, she copied that too and distributed the copies to every household. The things that were not visible were Garrett's work mostly. He moved through the western terrain at night with the efficiency of someone who had been navigating it for 6 years, and what he brought back was information. The size of Rourke's camp, the shift patterns of the men on watch, the locations of the access points that Rourke's men used to enter the valley. And then came the night that none of the preparation was enough for. It was the 21st of December, the longest night of the year, and the cold had deepened to a degree that made outdoor work dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Rourke. Elena Marsh had sent word in the afternoon that all was well at her place, and Fran Dodd was with her, and they had supplies enough for a week. The Keenans had a sick child. Nothing serious, Mary had said, but enough to keep them close to home. Nathan had gone to bed early because the cold made his lingering recovery worse. Evelyn was alone in the kitchen going over her documentation ledger when Garrett knocked on the door at midnight, and his face told her before he said a word. "It's Elena's place," he said. "Fire." She was already moving for her coat. "Wait." His voice stopped her. There was something in it she hadn't heard before. Not hesitation, because Garrett didn't hesitate, but a quality of control that was different from his usual stillness, harder, like something being held very carefully. She turned around. "Elena got out," he said. "And Fran." He stopped. She looked at him, and she understood from the way he stopped. "Who?" she said. He looked at her. "Elena's youngest, Anna. She went back inside." He stopped again. "For the cat, they think. A child's reasons." His voice was entirely level and entirely terrible. The roof came down before anyone could get her out. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn stood with her coat in her hands and the cold coming through the door Garrett had left open, and something happening in her chest that was large and silent and had no good name. Anna Marsh had been 11 years old. She had been the child who ran fastest when they were rebuilding the Keenan barn. She had brought Evelyn a jar of honey in September from a hive her mother kept on the east side of the property, and she had presented it with the solemn courtesy of a child doing something she understood to be adult. "Elena," Evelyn said. "Cole's with her. And Phelps. I rode straight here." He looked at her. "I didn't want you to hear it from someone else." She put her coat on. Her hands were not entirely steady. She let them be unsteady while she buttoned the coat and didn't think about steadiness. "We go to Elena," she said. "Yes." She took the lamp off the hook and went to wake Nathan, and then she went outside into the longest night of the year with the cold so deep it felt like the dark had weight, and she rode toward Elena Marsh's property, where a fire had gone to embers in the ruins of a house, and a mother was sitting in the snow outside because there was nowhere else to be. What happened inside Evelyn Hart on that ride was not something she put in her journal afterward. Some things were too large for the journal, too raw to survive being turned into sentences. What she knew, riding through the dark with Garrett's horse at her left shoulder and Nathan's at her right, was that the woman she had been when she stepped off the train in July, the woman who had been patient and strategic and deliberately measured in everything, was different from the woman riding now. Patience was one kind of strength. What she felt now was another kind entirely. She did not forgive the cold. She did not forgive the dark. She did not forgive the distance still between her and the place she was riding toward, where Elena Marsh had already lived through the worst moment of her life, and would be living through it still when Evelyn arrived, and would go on living through it long after. She rode. The valley held its breath around her. The mountains were black shapes against a sky with no light in it. Anna Marsh had been 11 years old. Evelyn Hart did not weep on that ride. There would be time for grief, and she would give it the time it deserved. But for now, something colder and quieter than grief had settled in her, the thing that lived below grief and survived it. The absolute non-negotiable refusal to let this be what the story said about this valley, about these people, about what happened when you chose to stay. She would not let this be the end of it. She rode and the dark held, and ahead of her the embers of Elena Marsh's house gave the only light in the valley, a cold red glow at the center of the longest night of the year. They buried Anna Marsh on the 23rd of December in the frozen ground at the eastern edge of her mother's ruined property, because Elena had said that was where she wanted her. On the land, in the ground that had been their ground, not moved somewhere else, not tucked away in the town cemetery where strangers would walk past without knowing what they were walking past. The digging took 4 hours. The ground was iron hard and it fought them the whole way down, and Nathan and Cole and Frank Alcott worked in rotation because no single man could keep swinging a pick at frozen earth for more than 20 minutes before his arms gave out. Garrett worked longest. He didn't say this was deliberate and nobody asked him if it was. But Evelyn watched him refuse to stop when Nathan tried to take the pick from him, watched him keep working with the particular grim efficiency of someone doing hard physical labor as a form of language when there were no words for what he was feeling. Elena stood through all of it without sitting down and without leaning on anyone, which was not strength exactly, or not only strength. It was the way some people stood at the edge of the thing that had broken them, upright, not because they were unbroken, but because sitting down felt like a decision they weren't ready to make. Evelyn stood beside her through most of it. She didn't speak. She had learned over the months in this valley that the presence of another person was sometimes the only help that was actually help, and that words in those circumstances were mostly for the person speaking them and not for the person who needed to hear something. So she stood, and Elena stood, and the men dug, and the December sky was white and low and enormous above them all. When it was done and the words had been said, Colbrigg spoke briefly, the kind of plain and honest words that had clearly come from somewhere real. Elena looked at Evelyn and said very quietly, "Tell me what you're going to do." "What do you mean?" "I can see it in your face. Something changed in you on the ride over." Elena's gray eyes were dry and direct. "Tell me what you're planning." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Nothing yet," she said. "I'm still thinking. When you stop thinking, tell me." Elena looked back at the grave. "I want to know." She thought for 4 days. She did not tell Nathan what she was thinking, not yet, because she needed to think it all the way through before she said it out loud, and because some ideas changed shape when you said them. Either they became more solid or they fell apart, and she needed to know which this one was before she invited someone else's judgment on it. She went through the documentation ledger. She went through everything Garrett had told her about the Western camp, and she sent Garrett back up to the ridge twice more to confirm things she needed to confirm. She wrote letters to Barrett in Bridger's Fall, to the county recorder's office, to the territorial land office in Helena, whose address she'd gotten from the county clerk, and to a newspaper in Billings that she knew had covered land disputes before, because what happened in this valley was the kind of thing newspapers wrote about, and newspaper coverage was a form of record that was harder to suppress than a county ledger. On the 4th day, she told Garrett, they were outside in the failing afternoon light, working on the fence she never seemed to finish adding to, and she said without preamble, the way she'd learned he preferred, "I want to go to Rourke's camp directly." Garrett stopped working. "Not with weapons," she said, "with the documentation. The fraudulent survey, the county records, Barrett's letter confirming the contestation, the log of every incident since July. All of it together, all of it signed and witnessed and real." She paused. "I want to put it in front of him and give him the option to leave the valley on his own terms before the court takes it on terms he doesn't control." Garrett was looking at her with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely uncertain how to respond, which was unusual for him. "You want to walk into a camp with 40 armed men and hand Victor Rourke a folder of papers. Not walk in, ride in broad daylight, with someone who knows the terrain well enough that we can get out if we need to." She looked at him. "You." Evelyn. She almost registered surprise. He had not used her first name before, and the fact that he used it now told her he was taking this more seriously than the measured tone of his voice suggested. "I know what it sounds like," she said. "It sounds like something a person does when they've decided to lose their patience with being careful. Maybe it is." She set down the fence tool and turned to face him directly. "He killed a child. He's not going to stop. The court takes months, and he's going to keep burning and cutting and intimidating until there is no valley left to win in court. I need him to understand that what he's doing has a cost. Not just legally, not just eventually, but right now to his reputation, his standing, the men who work for him." She paused. "A man who's facing a county court contest, a territorial land office review, and a newspaper reporter who's already been sent a letter about fraudulent surveys. That man is not in as strong a position as he thinks he is. I want to show him the shape of that position." Garrett picked up his tool and set it down again. "And if he decides the simplest response is to make sure you can't testify to any of it, then we don't let him do that. That is a significant don't." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to say it's a good plan. I'm asking you if you can get us in and out of that camp." He was quiet for a long time. The wind came off the ridge and moved through the fence posts they'd been working on, and the light was going, and somewhere behind them in the house, Nathan was making the sounds of someone cooking supper, a clanking of the stove that had become the reliable background of her evenings. "I know 3 ways in and out of that camp," Garrett said finally. "2 of them Rourke's men know. One of them, they don't. That's a yes? That's information. He picked up the fence tool again. Tell Nathan tonight. If he tries to stop you, listen to what he says and then decide. Don't make this decision without telling him. She hadn't intended to. I wasn't going to. I know, he said. I'm saying it anyway. Tum-tum-tum. Nathan didn't try to stop her. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything she said. And when she was done, he was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that was thinking rather than reluctance. And then he said, You've written the letters already. The newspaper, the territorial office? Yes. So even if Rourke decides to... He didn't finish the sentence, but it was finished anyway, hanging in the warm air of the kitchen between them. The record already exists. It already exists, she confirmed, in multiple places, with multiple parties. He can't make it disappear. Nathan looked at the table. He looked at his hands, which had regained most of their strength over the past months, which were the hands of a man who had been very close to dying and had come back from it, and was perhaps not as afraid of risk as he might have been before that experience. I want to come with you. No. Evelyn, if something goes wrong, the Valley needs someone here who knows everything I know and can keep them together. That has to be you. She looked at him steadily. Not because you're less capable, because you're more necessary here. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the logic of it, and the part underneath the logic that was not logic, that was simply not wanting her to go toward something dangerous without him. Come back, he said. It came out simpler than he'd probably intended it, and she thought that was probably why it landed the way it did. That's the plan, she said. They left before dawn on December 28th. Garrett knew the route in the dark the way he knew most things about this terrain. Quietly, without reference to landmarks, navigating by memory and some other sense that was harder to name, the accumulated knowledge of 6 years of moving through a landscape in all seasons and conditions. Evelyn rode behind him and watched the western ridge grow against the pre-dawn sky and tried to think about what she was going to say rather than about what might happen if the saying of it went badly. She had the documentation in a leather satchel, the full ledger, the county records, Barrett's letter, the copies she'd made of everything. She had also, tucked into the inside of her coat, a single piece of paper with a list of every name she'd sent letters to, dated and addressed, in case Rourke wanted to know how many places the information had already gone. The access point Garrett had mentioned, the one Rourke's men didn't know, turned out to be a dry creek bed on the northern edge of the camp's perimeter, navigable on horseback in the winter because the ground was frozen hard enough to carry weight. They came up the back of the camp as the sky was going from black to the dark gray of pre-dawn, and Garrett stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked at the cluster of structures below them. 3 large tents, 2 permanent-looking structures of rough lumber, horses in a rope corral, cook smoke rising. There'll be a man on watch, he said quietly. Southeast corner, which means he's facing the valley, not the ridge. We go in from the north, direct to the main structure. We don't give them time to think. And if they shoot first and think after, I'm going to count on the fact that it's nearly dawn and most of Rourke's men are asleep, and the ones who aren't will want to know who we are before they do anything permanent. He looked at her. Rourke specifically. Whatever else he is, he's not a man who makes permanent decisions in the dark. He's too calculating for that. She had reached the same conclusion, which was part of why she was here. Let's go, Shinchim. They were seen at the edge of camp by a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, who was carrying a rifle and a look of profound surprise that told her Garrett had been right about the watch position. He hadn't expected anyone from the north. Ma'am, he said, with the instinctive courtesy of someone raised to address women a certain way regardless of the circumstances, and then seemed to realize that courtesy might not be the appropriate register for someone who had just ridden into a private military camp at dawn. You need to stop. I need to see Victor Rourke, she said. Tell him Evelyn Hart is here. And Hart is... The young man looked at Garrett, who was a large and unreadable presence on a gray horse, and who returned the look with complete equanimity. The young man made a decision and went to the main structure and knocked, and there was a muffled conversation, and then the door opened and Victor Rourke came out. He was dressed, which surprised her slightly. She had half expected to catch him unprepared, and he wasn't. He was dressed and he was alert, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in town and outside the homestead, with that practiced stillness, that was entirely about control. But there was something else underneath it now, she thought, a tightness around the eyes that hadn't been there before. "Miss Hart," he said. "This is unexpected. I'd like to talk," she said. "Inside, if you're willing. I have some things to show you." He looked at Garrett. "Your trapper friend waits outside." "He stays where he can see me," she said. "That's not a negotiation." A pause. Rourke assessed the situation with the speed of a man who did it constantly and was good at it. "Fine," he said. He gestured toward the door. "Come in." The interior of the main structure was warmer than she expected and more organized. A work table with maps, a chair on each side of it, an oil lamp burning. He had been working, she realized. Before dawn, working. Whatever else she thought of him, he was not a lazy man. She sat across from him and put the satchel on the table and did not open it yet. "How is Elena Marsh?" Rourke said. His voice was even and without any visible quality that could be called regret. "Her daughter is dead," Evelyn said. "I assume you know that." "I heard." "Did you order it?" He looked at her. "I gave no order to harm anyone." "Your men started a fire in a house where people were sleeping. I have no knowledge of anyone deliberately starting a fire." The words were precise, chosen the way a man chose words when he was thinking about how they would sound later. "I regret the child's death. That was not—" He paused. "That was not intended." "Perhaps not." She kept her voice level. "But it happened. And it happened because you've been running a campaign of intimidation against the residents of this valley for 2 years. And when you escalate that kind of campaign, you lose control of where it ends." She opened the satchel. "I'm going to show you something." She laid out the documentation methodically, the way she'd laid it out in her head 100 times on the ride over. The county records from Bridger's fall, the signed copies, Barrett's letter in its specific language about the fraudulent 1878 survey, the Territorial Land Office acknowledgement, received 3 days ago, confirming receipt of her complaint and initiating a review. The newspaper editor's response from Billings, brief, but confirming that a reporter had been assigned to look into land disputes in the Harlins Valley area. She placed each document on the table as she went, and she watched Rourke's eyes move across them with the reading speed of an intelligent man absorbing a large amount of bad news. When she was done, she said, "The court hearing for the water rights contestation is scheduled for March. The county recorder has already confirmed that the 1878 survey cannot be substantiated in the official record. My attorney considers the claim fraudulent and contestable." She paused. "The Territorial Land Office review may take longer, but once it's initiated, it's on record. It cannot be uninitiated." Rourke was looking at the documents. His face was doing very little, but the tightness around the eyes was more visible now, and she had spent enough time watching careful men to recognize when careful men were revising their calculations. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to leave this valley. Take your men, take your equipment, drop the water rights claim, and go build your empire somewhere else." She kept her voice entirely neutral. "You can do that on your own terms, in your own time, and whatever you've done here stays in the past. The families stay on their land. No one pursues additional action. And if I don't, then the court decides in March, and then the territorial office completes its review. And then the newspaper runs the story they're already researching, and then every land transaction you've attempted in this territory is subject to review, because fraud in one matter tends to invite scrutiny in others." She folded her hands on the table. "You're a man who builds things. You understand that you can't build something lasting on a foundation that's about to be pulled out from under it." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. "You're more dangerous than I thought," he said finally. "You didn't think about me at all," she said. "That was your first mistake." Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely read. It wasn't admiration, because he wasn't that kind of man, but it was something in the same family as recognition, the acknowledgement of an opponent who had turned out to be one. "I'll need time to consider. You have a few days." She began gathering the documents back into the satchel. "I'll leave you a copy of the contestation filing and Barrett's letter. The originals go back with me." She was almost to the door when he said, "Miss Hart." She turned. "The family's in the valley," he said. "They're not fighters. You're fighting for people who would have sold if you hadn't been there." She looked at him. That's probably true of some of them, she said. It doesn't make what you've done to them any less wrong, and it doesn't change what comes next. She went out into the dawn. Garrett was where she'd left him, on his horse at the edge of camp, looking entirely calm in the way of someone who had not in fact been calm, and was not going to show it, now that the worst hadn't happened. They rode north without speaking until they were back through the dry creek bed and into the tree line, and then Garrett said, "How did it go?" He listened. Did he agree? Not yet. She adjusted the satchel on her saddle. He's thinking about it. That's better than I expected. It's better than I hoped. She looked at the ridge above them, at the pale December sky, at the valley spread below to the east, the homesteads visible as small, warm shapes in the cold morning. He's not going to fold cleanly. Men like that don't. But I think I showed him the shape of what it costs him to stay. They rode in silence for a while. The morning was coming up gray and cold, and the horses moved through it with the even patience of animals doing what they were built to do. After a while, Garrett said, "You weren't afraid in there." "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid the whole time." "You didn't show it." "That's not the same as not feeling it." She looked ahead at the trail that led back toward the homestead. "Being afraid and choosing not to let it make decisions for you, that's not the same as not being afraid." He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said, "it isn't." Rourke's answer came not in days but in hours, and it was not the answer she had expected. She was back at the homestead by mid-morning. She had told Nathan what had happened, had shown him the copies she'd left with Rourke and the ones she'd brought back, had watched him sit with it and process it in the quiet way he processed difficult information. They were at the table drinking coffee when the sound of horses came from outside. Not one horse, several, moving fast. She went to the window. 5 men. She recognized 2 of them from the camp, and the one leading them was not Rourke. She said, "Well, Garrett," but Garrett was already outside. He had been at the barn and he'd heard the horses before she had, and when she came through the door, he was standing between the arriving men and the house with a stillness so complete it was almost a physical thing. The man leading the riders stopped his horse and looked at Garrett, and then looked past him at Evelyn. "Mr. Rourke has decided he'd like the rest of those documents," he said. He was a broad man with a flat face and an accent she couldn't place, and he said this with the flat assurance of someone who was not making a request. "Mr. Rourke can attend the court hearing in March," she said. "He'll see them there. He'd prefer not to wait." "I'm sure he would." She kept her hands visible, her voice steady. "You can tell him the answer is no. The documents are in order and they stay where they are." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett again. "You're going to want to move," he said to Garrett. "I'm comfortable where I am," Garrett said. What happened next was fast and had a quality of the inevitable to it. The way things moved when they'd been moving toward a point for a long time and finally got there. 2 of the men dismounted. Garrett moved to intercept the nearer one and was hit from the side by the second, and the flat-faced man came off his horse and went for Evelyn directly. And she stepped back and felt herself caught from behind by someone she hadn't seen come around the side of the house. And then there were hands on her arms, and the satchel was gone from her shoulder, and she was on her knees in the snow and her face hurt from where she'd hit the ground. And it had taken perhaps 30 seconds. Nathan was at the door. She looked at him and shook her head hard. "Don't come out. The numbers are wrong." And she held his eyes until she saw him hold still, which cost him something visible. Garrett was on the ground, not unconscious. She could see him moving, trying to get up, but there were 2 men holding him down and a third with a boot on his shoulder. The flat-faced man stood over her with the satchel. He opened it and looked at the contents and then looked at her with the same flat expression. "Mr. Rourke said to tell you that you made a mistake coming to see him this morning." "He made a mistake not taking the offer," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw something in his face. Not admiration, not what Rourke had, something less complicated. He said, "Get up. You're coming with us." They were taken to a holding structure on the south side of Rourke's camp, not the main building, but a smaller one, built of logs, with a bar on the door that dropped from the outside. It was cold and dark and smelled of old hay and not much else. Garrett was put in with her, which was either a mistake on Rourke's part or a sign that Rourke didn't consider Garrett a meaningful threat in a locked room, which was also a mistake. Her face was bleeding from the fall. She could feel it drying in the cold. Garrett had a cut above his eye and was moving the way she recognized, with the careful economy of someone managing pain rather than not feeling it. "Are you all right?" she said. "I've been worse." He looked at the door, the walls, the ceiling, with the systematic attention of a man taking inventory. "The door's the weak point. It's a bar, not a lock. It drops into a bracket on the outside. You can sometimes lift it from inside if there's enough gap at the top." "Is there enough gap?" He looked. "I don't know yet." She sat down against the wall. Her head ached. She thought about the documents in Rourke's hands, the copies, not the originals. The originals were still at the homestead with Nathan. She'd kept a second set there on purpose, precisely because she'd known she might not come back with what she'd taken. The copies were enough for him to understand what she had, but not the actual evidence. The evidence was still in Nathan's possession. "He's going to make a decision quickly," she said. "He knows we came here without telling the others where we were going, or he'll assume that. He'll want to act before people start looking for us. Nathan knows where we went. Nathan knows we went to the camp. He doesn't know we'd be taken." She looked at the ceiling, thinking. How long before he sends someone? "If we're not back by dark, he'll send someone. That's Nathan." Garrett's voice was certain in the way of someone who knew the person he was talking about. "By tonight. It's not yet noon. We have 7 or 8 hours. She looked at the gap above the door. "Show me what you were looking at." The gap was less than 2 inches, barely enough to work with, but Garrett was patient and methodical about it and had, in his coat pocket, a folded piece of leather that he used as a shim when he was setting traps, which was thin and stiff enough to slide into the gap. He worked at it quietly and without visible frustration, and Evelyn held the lamp she'd found in the corner. No oil, but she turned the glass chimney in her hands as she thought about what was happening outside this room. Rourke had the copies of the documents. He knew what was in them. He was also smart enough to know that copies meant originals existed somewhere, which meant Nathan, which meant the homestead. If Rourke's intention was to make the problem go away completely, he would have to go to the homestead, and going to the homestead in daylight with Nathan there and possibly others was a different calculation than anything he'd done before. But a man facing a court hearing in March, a territorial review and a newspaper reporter, was a man whose calculation had changed. She had done that. She had changed his calculation. And the problem was that she hadn't fully anticipated that a changed calculation might make him more dangerous rather than less. "Garrett." "Almost," he said. "If we get out, we need to go south, not north. If Rourke sends men to the homestead, they'll take the western approach, the one they know. We can get ahead of them if we go south and cut east through the lower creek crossing." "That's 4 miles longer." "I know." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You think he's already sent them?" "I think he made a decision faster than I expected him to." She set the lamp chimney down. "He didn't wait for us to come back and give him the answer. He sent those men within 2 hours. That's someone who had already decided before I walked into his office. He was going to take the documents regardless of what you offered." "Yes." She thought about that, about the conversation, about the way he'd listened, about the tightness around his eyes. He was scared, not of me specifically, of the documents. He knew the survey was weak and he'd been hoping nobody had found the county records. She stood up. I showed him exactly what he was afraid of, and he responded the only way he knew how. "How close?" she said. "Getting there." Garrett's voice was strained. He had the leather shim angled upward, lifting slowly, trying to get it under the bar. "If this doesn't work, the other option is the west wall. One of those logs is set shallow. I can feel it." "How long?" "Longer." She went to the west wall and found the log he meant. Third from the bottom, a section that moved very slightly when she pushed it, poorly anchored at the corner joint. She started working it with her fingers, methodically, not thinking about the cold in her hands, not thinking about what was happening at the homestead, just working. Outside she could hear the camp sounds, horses, voices, the particular audio texture of a place that had between 30 and 40 men in it. And she tried to read it for urgency, for the sound of rapid departure, and couldn't tell from inside a log room with the wind going. Then she heard something clearer, boots outside the door. More than one set. Stopping. She and Garrett looked at each other. "Get away from the door," he said quietly. far wall. She moved. The bar lifted from outside. The door opened. The flat-faced man came in with one other, and he looked at them against the far wall, and then at the log above the door where Garrett's shim was still wedged, and his expression shifted very slightly into something that might have been professional acknowledgement of effort. "Mr. Rourke wants to see you," he said. "The feeling isn't mutual," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "That's not an option. Move." Rourke was in the main structure at the work table, and he was looking at the copies of her documents, which were spread across the map-covered surface. He looked up when they came in, and she saw it in his face. Not triumph, not the smoothness of a man who thought he'd won, but something more complicated. The look of a man who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with where it had brought him. "Sit down," he said. Neither of them sat. He looked at them for a moment and didn't push it. "Barrett," he said. "The lawyer in Bridger's Fall. What about him?" "He has the original contestation." "He does." "And the county records, copies." "The originals are filed with the county recorder. You can't touch them." He looked at the documents again. "This is well done," he said, and she heard in it the particular weariness of a man who was used to having the more capable position and had just discovered he didn't. "I don't say that to compliment you. I say it because it tells me something about what my options are." "Your options are the same ones I presented this morning," she said. "Nothing has changed about that. Something has changed." He looked up at her. "You came here. Directly. That tells me the Valley is willing to fight in ways I hadn't anticipated." He was quiet for a moment. "I've built an operation here over 2 years. I have 40 men on payroll. Every week that this territory is contested, that costs me money. And if the court rules against the water claim, it will. Then I've spent 2 years and considerable resources on a holding that becomes worthless to me without the water." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the camp with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that was coming out badly. "I want something. You're not in a position to want things. I'm in a position that both of us understand is more complicated than that." He turned around. "I want the Valley families to agree not to pursue criminal charges for the marsh fire. I want it in writing, from every household." She looked at him. "You're asking the people whose child died to agree not to pursue criminal charges against the men responsible. I'm asking them to take what they can get, which is their land and their water, and let the rest go." His voice was flat. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like what it is," she said. "It sounds like a man who burned a child in her home, asking for protection from the consequences of it." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "that is what it is." The room was very quiet. Garrett was standing beside her, and she could feel the specific quality of his stillness, which was different from his usual stillness, tighter, held with more effort. She thought about Elena. She thought about what Elena had said at the grave. "Tell me what you're going to do." She thought about March and the court and the territorial review and the months of further fighting, and she thought about the Valley as it would be in April when the legal process was done, and whether the families who were already exhausted would still be standing in it. She said, "I'll take it to them. I can't make that agreement myself." "I understand that. And I'm telling you right now that Elena Marsh's answer will be no. She has that right, and I won't argue with her about it." "Then we're not going to reach an agreement." "I didn't say that. I said Elena Marsh's answer will be no, and she has that right." She looked at him steadily. "But perhaps there are other terms. Perhaps what the Valley wants is not criminal prosecution, which would be slow and uncertain and require Elena to stand in a courtroom and relive everything, but accountability of a different kind. Public accountability." He narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means you appear before the county commissioner and make a public statement about what your men did at the Marsh property. On record. In your name." She held his gaze. "You don't admit criminal intent. You admit that your employees took actions that resulted in the death of a child and that you're withdrawing your water rights claim and vacating this territory." She paused. "Your name is on it. That's accountability." The silence stretched. "That's not nothing," he said finally. "No, it isn't." He turned back to the window. She waited, watching his reflection in the glass. The careful man with the practiced stillness doing the arithmetic that had been coming out badly and finding that it still came out badly, just in a different shape now. "You can go," he said. I'll have your horses brought around. And the documents. A pause. And the documents. What? The flat-faced man gave her the satchel at the door of the camp, and he did it without comment. She checked the contents, all there, intact, and buckled it without hurry, which was difficult given that every part of her wanted to be on a horse moving east at the maximum possible speed. They were 200 yards from the camp when she heard the hoofbeats behind them. Her stomach dropped. She looked at Garrett. He was already angling north toward the tree line, and she followed him, and they had made the trees before the riders caught up to them. 3 men, not the flat-faced man, different ones, and they stopped at the tree line, and one of them called out, "Mr. Rourke says to tell you to be out of the valley by January 1st, or the deal's off the table." She pulled up her horse and turned and looked at them across the 50 yards of snow. "You tell Mr. Rourke," she said, clearly and without raising her voice because the cold carried sound well, "that the valley isn't going anywhere, and if he wants to make a deal, he has until January 1st to come make one in front of witnesses. After that, the court decides." She turned her horse east and rode, and Garrett rode beside her, and the 3 men didn't follow. They came down out of the ridge in the mid-afternoon to find the valley had already assembled itself, not by her planning, by Nathan's. He had sent word when they hadn't returned by noon, and the homesteaders had come. The Keenans, the Alcotts, Cole Briggs, Elena Marsh herself, standing in the yard of the Crowley homestead with her coat pulled tight and her face showing everything the last week had cost her, and not showing defeat, which was the important thing. Even Phelps was there, standing apart from the others the way he always stood, but present, his presence itself a kind of statement. Nathan met her at the gate. He looked at her face, at the dried blood on her cheek, and his expression did something complicated that resolved itself into a kind of steady anger that was quieter than most people's anger and colder. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Not seriously." He looked at Garrett. "Are you?" "No." He nodded once. He didn't touch her face, though she thought he wanted to, and she thought she understood why he didn't, because they were standing in a yard full of people who were frightened and needed something to hold on to, and him touching her face would have communicated fear rather than steadiness. "Tell us," he said. She told them. All of it. The conversation with Rourke, the documents, the taking, and the locked room, and Rourke's counteroffer, and what she'd said. She told it plainly, the way she told things, and she watched the faces of the people around her while she told it. Daniel Keenan's jaw going tight, Frank Alcott's eyes going cold, Mary Keenan's hands finding her husband's hand without looking for it, Cole Briggs listening with the focused attention of someone building a tactical picture, Phelps standing with his arms crossed and his pale eyes very still, and Elena Marsh. Elena listened to every word. Her face was unreadable in the specific way of someone who is managing a very large internal event and not letting any of it out because letting it out would make it harder to stand up. When Evelyn finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. "He wants us to not pursue charges," she said. Not a question. "He asked for that as a starting point. I told him I couldn't agree on behalf of the valley. I told him your answer would be no." Elena looked at the ground. "And what did you offer instead?" "A public statement, on record, in his name." Silence. "Tell me exactly what that means," Elena said. Evelyn told her, the county commissioner, the public record, the language of acknowledgement without criminal admission. Elena listened with the same stillness she'd been listening with all along. And when Evelyn finished, Elena looked up and looked at her directly with those gray eyes that were dry, and had been dry since the 21st, and would probably be dry for a long time, because there was a kind of grief that was too big for tears. "Does it mean my daughter's name is on a public record?" Elena said. "Not a grave that only the valley knows about, but something the county keeps. That says she was here. That says what happened to her." "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's exactly what it means." Elena was quiet for a very long moment. The valley was quiet around them, the particular Montana winter quiet that was the absence of everything except wind and distance. "Then I'll take it," Elena said. "Not because it's enough. It's not enough. But because it's something real. And I want something real with her name on it." Nobody said anything. What Elena had just said didn't need response. It needed witnessing, which they all understood, and so they witnessed it. Then Cole Briggs said, "So what happens January 1st? Evelyn looked at them, all of them, the 7 families of the valley, The people she had come to know through fence repairs and barn raisings and midnight rides in the dark and grief, and all the ordinary and extraordinary days between July and now. We go to him, she said, all of us, in daylight, to the edge of his camp where his men can see, not with weapons, with witnesses. And we tell him the offer stands and we're still here, and he has until the end of the day to accept it, or the court decides in March. And if he sends his men out to meet us, Frank Alcott said, then they'll be looking at all of us, she said. Every one of us, all 7 families, every man and woman in this valley. And the man Rourke's afraid of isn't Frank Alcott with a rifle. It's a county court and a territorial office review and a newspaper reporter. Those things are already in motion, and they don't stop because his men ride out to meet us. She looked at them. We've been defending for 5 months. On January 1st, we stopped defending. We go to him, together, and we let him see what he's actually been dealing with. The valley held its breath. Nathan said, quietly from beside her, I'll ride. So will I, said Cole Briggs. One by one, the others said it, until the last voice was Phelps, who said it the way he said everything. Simply, without ceremony, as a statement of fact. I'll ride. The sun was low in the December sky, throwing long shadows across the snow, and Evelyn stood in the yard of a homestead that had been dying when she arrived and was alive because they had chosen to make it alive, and she felt something that was not triumph, not yet, not with so much still ahead, but something underneath triumph, the thing that made triumph possible. She thought about a train station in July and a woman holding a letter in the afternoon light. She thought about how that woman had stood on the platform and not found what she'd come for and had ridden north anyway. She thought, I would do it again. Every single day of it, I would do it again. Outside, the cold settled over the valley, and inside the house the stove was burning, and they had 4 days. The last day of December came in clear and brutal, the kind of cold that had no apology in it, the kind that settled over the valley like a verdict. Evelyn was up before 4. She built the fire, made the coffee, sat at the kitchen table with her hands around the cup, and looked at the documentation ledger one more time. Not because she needed to review it, but because it was the thing she had built out of all those months, the physical record of everything that had happened here, and she wanted to hold it once more before the day made it either necessary or unnecessary. Nathan came in from checking the livestock. He was moving well now, fully himself in a way that she hadn't seen until recently. The fever's residue finally burned off, his strength genuinely returned rather than approximated. He poured coffee and sat across from her and didn't say good morning because it seemed beside the point. How many people do you think will actually come? He said. All of them, she said. I think all of them will come. He looked at her. You're sure about this? No. She was honest about that, the way she tried to be honest about most things. I think it's the right move. I think Rourke's calculation has changed, and I think showing him the full weight of what he's dealing with is the thing most likely to end it without someone else getting killed. But sure, no, I'm not sure. He nodded slowly. That's good enough for me. She looked at him across the table. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that she trusted this man. Not in the abstract way you trusted an idea, but in the specific way you trusted someone who had shown you, repeatedly and without ceremony, that they meant what they said. He had been sick, and he had fought back. He had been afraid for her, and he had let her go anyway. He had stood in his own yard and said, "Come back," and meant it as both a request and a statement of faith. And she thought about that now, the compressed weight of those 2 words, and she thought that there were people who talked about trust as though it were given, and there were people who understood that it was built, slowly and imperfectly, out of 100 small moments of choosing to be honest when dishonesty would have been easier. Nathan, she said. He looked at her. When this is done, I want to talk about what we are to each other, not what the arrangement was, what we actually are. He held her gaze, and what moved across his face was not surprise, but something that had been waiting, patient and undemanding, for the moment she was ready. All right, he said. When this is done. They finished their coffee and went to saddle the horses. They came from every direction. The Keenans from the east, Daniel and Mary riding side by side with their oldest boy between them, old enough now that he'd asked to ride and been allowed. The Alcott brothers from the south, Frank on his big roan, and Samuel on the bay he'd had for 6 years. Cole Briggs alone from the northeast, sitting his horse with the particular quiet of a former soldier who knew the difference between a fight and a demonstration and was prepared for either. Elena Marsh from what had been her property, riding the borrowed horse the Keenans had lent her because her own animals had been lost in the fire, and she rode with her back straight and her eyes forward and the specific gravity of a woman who had buried her daughter 10 days ago and was still here. Fran Dodd came with Elena, the two of them side by side, and Fran looked frightened, which was the honest response, and she came anyway, which was the important thing, and Phelps. He came down from his ridge alone, ahead of the others, and was already waiting when Evelyn and Nathan arrived at the meeting point on the Western Road. A man who had spent 8 years not joining things, sitting his horse in the cold January air because he had decided that this was worth joining, and his presence said something that the dozen people around him understood without anyone saying it. Garrett rode in last. He came from the north, from a direction that told her he'd been up on the ridge watching the western camp before dawn, confirming what they were riding toward. He came alongside Evelyn and said quietly, "They're moving." "How many?" "Maybe 15, on horseback, armed." He paused. "Rourke's with them." She took that in. Rourke coming himself meant one of two things. He was coming to fight, or he was coming to talk. And the difference between those two things would become clear in the first 60 seconds of the encounter. "Everyone stays together," she said. "Nobody breaks formation, nobody responds to provocation. We stop where we agreed, and we hold." Garrett nodded. She turned her horse and looked at the group assembled behind her. 17 people, counting the Keenan boy, on horses that were their own horses, with no hired hands and no county backing and no certainty about how the next hour was going to go. They looked back at her with the faces of people who were tired and cold and had decided that tired and cold were not reasons to stop. She turned west and rode, and they followed. They met on the open ground at the edge of the valley, where the terrain flattened before it started rising toward the western ridge, and the cold morning light fell equally on both groups across a span of maybe 100 yards of snow. Rourke pulled up first. His men spread slightly behind him, the automatic formation of men who were accustomed to these arrangements, and their hands were on their weapons, but nothing was drawn. Rourke himself was looking at the assembled homesteaders with an expression that Evelyn couldn't read at this distance, but that she suspected was not what he had expected to see. She rode forward 10 yards and stopped. Nathan came with her. The others held their position. Rourke rode forward to meet her. Up close, in the flat January morning light, he looked different than he had in his camp or in town. Not smaller exactly. He was still a large and controlled man, but there were lines in his face she hadn't fully registered before. The lines of a man who had not been sleeping well, who had been running the numbers and not finding them coming out in his favor, and who had been aware of this for several days at least. He looked like a man who had carried a plan for a long time and had recently understood that the plan was not going to arrive where he'd expected. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Rourke." She looked at him steadily. "You came yourself." "I thought it warranted it." He looked past her at the assembled homesteaders, took in the faces, the numbers, the particular quality of the group's presence. Rooted, she thought. They looked like people who were standing on their own ground. "Your attorney filed the contestation in Bridger's Fall." "He did." "And the Territorial Land Office." "Yes." "And the Billings paper ran a brief item last week about land disputes in this valley." He looked at her. "You've been thorough." "I've been careful," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Behind her, she could hear the horses shifting in the cold, the small sounds of 17 people holding themselves still. Behind Rourke, his men were quiet too, and in the quiet between the two groups, the valley breathed around them. The creek, the wind, the enormous, indifferent mountains. "I've thought about what you proposed," Rourke said. "The county commissioner, the public statement." "And?" He looked at her for a long moment. There was a quality to it that she recognized. The look of a man closing a door that he had imagined himself walking through for 2 years, making it final, accepting the closing. "I'll do it," he said. "The statement. On the conditions we discussed. The valley keeps its land. The water rights claim is withdrawn. Your men vacate by the end of the month." "Yes." "And you appear before the county commissioner, in your name, on record." "Yes." He said it flatly, without drama, The way you said something you'd decided and didn't want to perform. She looked at him. That's the agreement. That's the agreement. He held her gaze. I want it in writing, signed by you and by a legal witness. Barrett will draft it. He can have something ready by the end of the week. Rourke nodded. He looked past her one more time at the assembled valley, and she wondered what he saw. Whether he saw the thing she saw, which was not a group of fighters, but something more fundamental than fighters. People who had decided that what they'd built was worth standing in front of, and who had acted on that decision every single day for 5 months, regardless of the cost. She thought he probably saw something like that. She thought that was likely why he'd come himself. He turned his horse without another word and rode west, and his men turned with him, and Evelyn watched them go until the ridge took them. She turned around. The valley stood behind her in the January light, 17 faces looking back at her, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Elena Marsh said, from somewhere in the middle of the group, Is it done? Almost, Evelyn said, but close enough for today. Bochum. The agreement was signed 11 days later in Bridger's Fall, in Barrett's office, with Nathan and Cole Briggs as witnesses, and Frank Alcott standing in the back of the room because he'd insisted on being there and nobody had argued with him about it. Rourke signed without ceremony. He did not look at anyone while he signed. He looked at the document, signed it, capped his pen, and left. Barrett watched him go and then looked at Evelyn with the expression of a lawyer who had seen a great deal and was genuinely impressed by the specific shape of this outcome. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said. I've never seen someone with that much operating capital walk away from a claim without a court ordering it. He made a business calculation, she said. He made more than that. Barrett looked at the signed document. A man like Rourke could have stalled this in court for a year, maybe longer. He had resources to do it. The fact that he didn't... He paused. What did you say to him? In that camp. She thought about it. I showed him what it would cost him, she said, and I think somewhere in there he understood that the cost included something he hadn't put in the calculation initially. Which was? She picked up her copy of the signed agreement. Being the kind of man who burns down a house with a child in it, she said. I think even men like Rourke have things they'd rather not be. Barrett was quiet for a moment. You're generous. I'm realistic, she said. Generous would be forgiving him. I haven't done that. The public statement before the county commissioner was held on a Thursday in late January, and it was the most uncomfortable hour Evelyn had witnessed since arriving in Montana. Rourke stood before the commissioner, a phlegmatic man named Hollis who had clearly been briefed and who conducted the proceeding with the careful neutrality of someone who understood its significance. And he stated, in language that Barrett had drafted and Rourke had agreed to, that employees acting under his authority had been responsible for actions on the Marsh property that had resulted in the death of Anna Marsh, age 11, and that he was withdrawing all territorial claims in the Harlins Valley area and vacating the Western Camp by the end of January. It was on record, with his name on it. Elena sat in the front row and listened to every word, and her face was the face of someone absorbing something that was both less than enough and more than nothing, which was the honest description of most of what justice actually looked like when you got close enough to see it clearly. It was not the thing she deserved. It was the thing that existed. Afterward, outside the commissioner's office in the cold January air, Elena stood beside Evelyn, and they watched Rourke's carriage move down the street. His name is on a document that has Anna's name on it, Elena said. That's what you said it would be. Yes. It doesn't bring her back. No. There was nothing to say to that but the truth. Elena was quiet for a moment. It matters anyway, she said finally. I didn't think it would, but it does. She looked at Evelyn. You came to this valley for a husband, and you got all of this instead. Evelyn looked at the street, at the January light on the storefronts of Bridger's Fall, at the unremarkable ordinary world that went on around extraordinary things without noticing. I got more than I came for, she said, in every direction. Elena made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. That's one way to put it. She pulled her coat tighter. Come back to the valley, she said. Stop standing in the street in Bridger's Fall. Tomorrow, Evelyn said. I'll come back tomorrow. What? Rourke's men were gone by the 28th of January. They left the Western Camp in pieces, equipment first, then the horses, then the men themselves in groups, the gradual deflation of a large operation withdrawing from a position. Garrett watched from the ridge and came down each evening with a count, and when the count reached 0, he said so without particular expression, which was how Garrett said everything. The camp itself they left as it was. The structures, the rope corrals, the ash circles from the cook fires, and for a while it sat on the western ridge like a scar, and then the February snows came and covered it, and by March it looked like a place where something had once been but wasn't anymore, which was what it was. The court hearing for the water rights contestation was formally concluded in early March, 3 weeks before its scheduled date, because Barrett moved to have it dismissed on the grounds that the claimant had withdrawn. The judge dismissed it. The fraudulent 1878 survey was flagged in the county records as unsubstantiated, and the original notation was amended. The Territorial Land Office closed its review with a finding that the claim had lacked proper basis. All of it was documented. All of it went into Evelyn's ledger, the final entries in a record that had begun the previous July, with a note under a gatepost. She wrote, on the last page of the ledger, "The valley is ours, not mine, ours." That distinction matters more than I can say. Spring came the way Montana springs came. Not gently, not with the gradual warming of milder climates, but in fits and starts, cold one day and raw the next. Then a week of sun that was genuinely warm before another cold snap. The season arguing with itself until finally, in late April, the argument was settled and the world went green almost overnight the way it did at this latitude, as if it had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. The valley changed with it. Elena rebuilt on her property. Not the original house. That ground had too much in it, she said, and everyone understood, but slightly north on a rise that looked down toward the creek. The Alcotts helped with the framing. Cole Briggs did the finish work on the windows and doors. Evelyn and Mary Keenan worked on the interior. It took 3 weeks, and it was not a perfect house. There were gaps in the planking on the east wall that would need addressing before next winter, and the chimney drew slightly crooked, but it was solid and it was hers, and she moved into it on a Tuesday afternoon in May with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who had been sleeping at the Keenans for 4 months and was ready to sleep in her own house again. The night Elena moved in, Evelyn sat in the new kitchen with her, and they drank coffee and didn't talk much, and the silence between them was the easy kind, the kind between people who have been through something together that neither of them needs to narrate. Before Evelyn left, Elena said, "The honey. You never got the second jar." It took Evelyn a moment. Then she understood. The honey Anna had brought in September, the promised second jar that had never been delivered because the seasons had moved faster than a child's errand. "No," she said. "I'm going to rebuild the hive this summer," Elena said. "When there's honey, I'll bring it to you myself." Evelyn looked at her. "I'd like that," she said. The conversation with Nathan happened on a Sunday evening in April when the snow was mostly gone from the lower valley and the creek was running high and fast with the melt, and the long light of the spring evening was coming through the windows of the homestead at the angle that made everything look like it was made of something warmer than it was. They were washing up after supper, which was a thing they did together in a routine so established it had stopped requiring thought, and Nathan said, without preamble, because he didn't circle around things, "You said we'd talk when it was done." "I did." He set down the dish he was holding. He turned to look at her. "I've been thinking about the advertisement I wrote," he said. "The one you answered, what I said I was looking for. A practical arrangement," she said. "Someone to share the work and the property. You were honest about your limitations. I was also limited in my imagination." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know enough to say what I actually needed. I wrote what I could put words to." She set down her own dish. "What would you say now, if you were writing it now?" He thought about that for a moment with the seriousness he gave to questions that mattered. "I'd say I was looking for someone who was braver than me," he said, "and smarter about certain things, and who wouldn't let me settle for less than what was possible." He paused. "I'd say I was looking for a partner, not an arrangement." "That's a different advertisement," she said. "Yes." His eyes were serious and direct, and entirely unguarded in the way he was when he decided to say the whole thing. "Evelyn, I know how I felt when you rode out to Rourke's camp and I stayed here. I know what I felt when you came back. I've known since September, probably earlier, but I didn't think it was the right time to say it. It's the right time now, she said. Is it the same for you? She thought about 8 months of letters, and a train station, and a note under a gatepost, and every day between then and now. The fence mending and the barn raising and the midnight rides and the cold and the loss and the particular quality of his stillness when he listened to her and the way he'd said come back like it was both a question and an answer. It's the same for me, she said. It's been the same for me for a while. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he'd done it in 6 months of living in the same house, and it was not a grand gesture. It was a man taking a woman's hand in a kitchen after supper, the most ordinary thing, the kind of thing that happened between people who had decided, and she thought that was exactly right. Exactly the kind of thing this was, and the kind of thing they were. Two imperfect and practical people who had chosen each other not out of desperation or obligation, but out of the specific knowledge of who the other person actually was. I'd like to get married, he said. If you're willing, not because we should, because I want to. I'm willing, she said. They were married in May by the Justice of the Peace in Harlan's Crossing, in the same town where she had stood on a platform 6 months earlier, looking for a man with a blue kerchief. The ceremony took 15 minutes, which suited them both. The witnesses were Garrett and Elena Marsh, which was the right combination of people. Someone who had been there from nearly the beginning, and someone who represented everything the valley had been through and survived. Afterward, they rode back to the homestead, and there was no celebration planned and no one had suggested one, which meant that by the time they arrived, there were 6 horses at the rail, and the Keenans had brought food, and the Alcott brothers had found, somewhere, a bottle of something drinkable, and Phelps had come down from his ridge for the second time in 6 months, which Cole Briggs said quietly to Evelyn constituted a personal record. It was not a large party, and it was not an elegant one. The food was plain, and the bottle went around and ran out before everyone had enough. And at some point, Daniel Keenan's youngest child fell asleep in the corner and had to be carried out. And Fran Dodd told a story about a previous neighbor's failed attempt at cattle ranching that was genuinely funny and made even Phelps, briefly, show something that was adjacent to a smile. Evelyn sat at her own table in her own house and looked at the people in it and thought, this is what I built. Not alone. None of it alone. But she had been the thing that held the shape of it when the shape was hardest to hold, and she knew that, and it was enough to know it without needing to say it. Garrett was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway for a moment after the others had gone, and he looked at Evelyn with the particular expression he had that was not quite readable and usually meant something important was happening underneath it. "You're staying," he said. Not a question. "I'm staying," she said. "Were you uncertain?" "No." He pulled his coat on. "I wanted to hear you say it." She smiled at that, actually smiled, the kind that happened without being decided. "You're staying too," she said. He looked briefly surprised by that, which was unusual for him. "I live on the North Ridge." "The North Ridge is in the valley." She looked at him. "You're part of this, whatever that is. You have been since before I got here." He stood with that for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she didn't try to name, because some things were complete in themselves and didn't need a name applied to them. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. "Good night, Garrett." He rode north, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go, and Nathan came to stand beside her, and they watched together until the tree line took him, and then they went inside and closed the door on the spring night. The valley grew, not quickly. Nothing in Montana grew quickly, but steadily. The way things grew when the conditions were genuinely right and the people tending them were paying attention. By the following summer, there were 2 new families who had come to the valley through word that had traveled the way good word traveled, which was slowly and person to person and with enough specificity to be credible. One of them was a young couple from further east who had heard, somehow, about the water rights case and the fraudulent survey and the outcome, and who had decided that a valley whose people had done that was a valley worth living in. The other was a former Army surgeon and his wife, who had no particular connection to the story, but who had found the land and the price fair, and the neighbors, on first meeting, honest. Phelps sold parcels of his northern land to both families, at prices that were fair rather than opportunistic, which his neighbors noted and did not make a public event of, but registered privately as the sign it was. A man who had spent 8 years alone on his ridge, deciding that maybe his wife had been right about him, and maybe there was something he could still do about it. Elena's hive produced honey in its second summer. She brought a jar to Evelyn on a morning in August and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. And Evelyn thanked her without ceremony, and Elena went home, and Evelyn kept the jar on the shelf where she could see it when she was working at the table, which she was, most mornings. Kept it not as a memorial exactly, but as a reminder that things continued, that the lives of people who were gone kept producing effects in the world for a long time after they left it, that a child who had run fastest at the barn raising and brought honey in September and gone back inside for a cat was still part of everything that happened after, still woven into the valley's account of itself. This was the thing Evelyn had come to understand about communities, real ones, not the word, but the actual thing, which was that they were not built from agreement or proximity or even shared suffering, though suffering was part of it. They were built from the repeated choice to remain accountable to each other, which was a choice that had to be made every single day and could not be made once and assumed to hold. You had to keep making it. And the making of it, over time, was what created the thing that was harder to break than any individual part of it. She had come to this valley with a suitcase and a letter, and the narrow belief that a life built on someone else's offered future was better than no future at all. She had found, instead, that the future she'd needed was the one she'd have to build herself. Not from scratch, not alone, but with the specific, irreplaceable people who had stood in Nathan's barn and said nobody breaks and meant it. What she had built with them was not perfect. It had gaps in it like Elena's east wall, things that would need addressing, things that the next winter would test again. It had grief in it that did not go away and was not supposed to go away. It had the shape of everything real, which was imperfect and ongoing and worth it. What she had not expected when she stepped off that train in July was to become the place itself. Not just to live in the valley, but to be part of what the valley was, to be something people pointed to when they tried to explain what the place was like, what it stood for, what kind of people it held. She had not sought that. She had only sought to stay. But staying, she had learned, was never only staying. Staying was a choice made every day against the alternatives, and in hard conditions, staying was the bravest thing most people could do. And when enough people chose it together, staying became building, and building became belonging, and belonging, slow and imperfect and real, became home. Garrett came down from the ridge twice a week now, more in the winters, and the pattern of his presence in the valley had changed the way all honest patterns changed over time, which was that it stopped being remarkable and became simply the way things were. He had rebuilt a smaller structure on the south edge of his North Ridge property, closer to the valley floor, which he said was practical because of the approach to the lower creek, which everyone accepted as the reason because it was probably part of the reason, and nobody needed more from him than what he gave. On an evening in the autumn of the second year, Evelyn sat on the step of the homestead in the early dark and looked at the mountains and thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform in Harlan's Crossing and not found what she'd come for. She thought about what that woman had decided in the quiet of a stranger's house on her first night in the valley, that a threat was only a threat until you decided it wasn't, and that she had decided. She had not known, making that decision, what it would cost. Nobody knew that in advance, which was probably necessary, because if you knew in advance what the deciding would cost you, you might not decide. You had to step into it without the full picture and trust that what you were and what you believed was enough to carry you through the parts you couldn't see yet. It had been enough. Barely, some days. Enough. Nathan came out and sat beside her on the step, and they sat together in the way they had learned to sit together, which was without requirement and without performance. Just two people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of who the other person was, which was the only choosing that meant anything. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky going to stars. The creek ran in the dark below the pasture. Somewhere north, Garrett's lamp was a small, warm point of light on the ridge. The valley was quiet and full of the particular alive quality of a place where people had decided to stay. Evelyn Hart, Evelyn Crowley. Now, though, she kept both names for the reasons she kept both names, which were her own, put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at what she had made of an abandoned promise, and she thought that this was the thing nobody told you about starting over. It was not about finding what you'd lost. It was about discovering what you were capable of building when the usual walls weren't there to stop you, when the ground was unfamiliar and the conditions were hard, and the only thing you knew for certain was that you weren't going back. She had come here for a future someone else had offered. She had built a different one, larger, harder, more real than anything she could have designed in advance. That was enough. That was more than enough.